Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again the next two chapters of Beyond Hypocrisy, decoding the age of the news in an age of propaganda, including the Doublespeak Dictionary, a book by Edward Herman. I'm going to leave the Google Drive link for the book in the description section. Please download the book and read it. I recommend you read all of my books. It's not worth just listening to the podcast. You need to download the book and you need to read the book if you want to get anything out of it. Reading is the way you first assimilate the facts. And then if you watch the podcast again, it helps you understand. But in any case, let's get some background, or let's discuss what we talked about yesterday. The key point that we wanted to discuss is the UNESCO withdrawal by the United States and Britain. Okay, the United States and Britain withdrew from UNESCO because they wanted to maintain the free flow of information. Okay, they wanted to retain the free flow of information. The Thatcher government and the Reagan government's withdrawal was a result of the secrecy, curtailment of access to information, covert operations, deception, and manipulation of the press that the media had. They wanted to increase the propaganda, the lies, the fraud, because they're imperialists. They are imperialist, racist, white supremacist, mafia thugs. Okay, they don't want to talk and discuss things. They want to forget the information. Okay, it's important to understand the press. The press needs to be honest. It needs to be, forthright. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be, responsible. It needs to be mature. It needs to be disciplined. These are the words that are important to understand when you talk about press. Maturity, discipline, honesty, for transparency, and truthfulness. Those words are the important words when you talk about the press. When you talk about secrecy, restricted access, you do covert operations or covert information, deception and manipulation. You're talking about a group of thugs, okay? You're talking about a group of thugs. Everybody knows the Western media is propagandist. Everybody knows it's lies and deceit. They just don't know why. The reason is that they don't, submit to norms. Okay, the U.S. government, we can take the U.S. government, for instance, we could take the U.S. government. In anything they do, whenever there's a world body that rules them as, criminals or, forces them to accept charges against them and of guilt, they withdraw. Okay, so the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, they don't subscribe to it. They don't think they needed to offer people human rights. So they withdrew from the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They have their own constitutional human rights, and they ignore the UN. Because when they want to, they can remove human rights from third world people. They can, in their own country, they can unconstitutionally remove human rights because you don't need to have any problem breaking American law in a country of American whites. Okay, they don't have any problem or any worry about breaking American law. That's the first thing. The second thing is, like the International Court of Justice, right? The International Court of Justice, they, decline to be part of it because then they can murder people anywhere in the world and not have any problem, right? I mean, they don't have to worry about it if the ICJ charges them. They're not a member of the state, so the signatories of the ICJ can't rule against them. So that's another thing. They can murder with impunity. That's a reason. And the same thing with UNESCO. Withdrawing from UNESCO allows them a world of opportunity to lie and deceive people, to promote pro-American propaganda and colonialist propaganda and imperialist ideas in the European and the American public and just the Western psyche. And then they can, do the colonialism. And then nobody can say anything. UNESCO can't say you're lying, right? They can make up allegations, any allegations, like the Bush allegation of nuclear weapons in Iraq, the Trump allegation of, nuclear weapons in Iran, all of the allegations about the pretext for the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, the allegations that the Nicaraguan Sandinistas were, transporting arms to El Salvador, Reagan's lies and deceit. All of it is an explanation of why they withdraw from UNESCO. So basically, America, you just have to call it a bullshit artist group. American press is bullshit artists. British press is bullshit artists. They're just bullshit artists. They don't need to follow any public or international rules. They can just bullshit. They can just bull the bullshit up. It can, accumulate, and it's just nothing. It creates nothing, no knowledge, nothing. That's ultimately the important thing to understand. The psychological benefit of withdrawing from these organizations that require you to submit to discipline, maturity, responsibility, truthfulness and transparency. Just withdraw, then you don't need to worry about it. That's the white supremacists of the British and American government. They're mafia thugs, as we said. They don't really care about, truth, transparency, maturity, responsibility, discipline, and, transparency. They don't care about any of those concepts. Those concepts are, meaningless in these white supremacist thugs. They're just thugs who want to walk around with guns and shoot wherever they go and say that we get away with it because we're whites. That's ultimately what it is. It's their divine right of whiteness for which they do it. So we talked about, basically, the victory of memory change of history. That's another concept we brought up as a result of, American, not being involved in, UNESCO. They can rewrite international and world history. They can rewrite American history. They don't need to subject themselves to any kind of scrutiny when it comes to their facts. They can say that Thomas Jefferson was a lover. He was a lover of blacks. He was a champion of blacks. Slavery was great. All of that stuff can come out. And, nobody can say anything, or nobody can, dispute that these facts are, deceptive and lying, and they're fraudulent, right? So they can, rewrite history books, which is what they do. Everyone complains about American history books. They lie and deceive people. Why? Because they're not a member of UNESCO, and nobody can criticize their fraudulent lies and deceit. So they can walk around and state anything, and nobody can say a word. In addition, we talked about the big lie. All you do is you introduce the big lie into, the world talk. You introduce the big lie into your discussion and then change the history of your intervention, for instance, to liberation as opposed to the truth of Western mass murder, torture, enslavement, neglect, disease production, and corrupt looting of the indigenous lands. This applies to British, American, and French colonial white supremacist mafia thugs. Then you can repeat the history so that there is no memory. And then you can see no dissent or outcry. And then you can repeat that, interaction. So that's another issue. We also want to, recognize that the New York Times is a U.S. Congress deceitful magazine. Just consider the New York Times a representative of the U.S. Congress deceitful frauds and liars. They, put the articles in the New York Times. It's basically a government, journal, a government handout of the American government. So if you want to read a government handout from the American government that is the New York Times, then you're wasting money and you're wasting time. But that's your choice. But I recommend you understand that the New York Times is basically a government handout of, American propaganda, lies, and fraud. The big lie, we can give the big lie, an example of the big lie. So one example of big lie is British history. An application of the big lie we talked about where you pretend that, it was a liberation struggle when it was actually a mass murder struggle. We saw that in all of America's interventions in Nicaragua. It was a liberation of the Nicaraguan people for which they, murdered and shot infants, Hispanics. They cut breasts off of Hispanic women while they were nursing their infants. They threw infants up in the air for target practice. This is the kind of American government, liberation. That's what they do to liberate. The same way they liberated in Chile. They liberated through, imprisonment, arm amputations, leg amputations, disease and slavery, right? Disease and slavery, Kwashior, Kior, Anasarca, malnutrition, all of this stuff. American government did all of these things to the Chilean Hispanics, and they liberated them, right? And that's the definition of liberation, is to make them suffer and, starve to death and, leave them dead on the street after you shoot them because you don't want them to talk about their disease or their problems. So that's the liberation that we're talking about. So those are the ideas. So let's talk about British history and liberation. So the British, history is totally, devoid in the Western, books. You will not find any descriptions of British colonial atrocities in any of their countries. There are no books that address this. Why? Because the British government are deceitful, liars, and frauds. They're not a member of UNESCO. They have decided to go around and take the books out of print, take them out, and remove them from, doing. If you try to look for a British military history book, military thuggery, anything that talks about this vicious campaign of terror in their colonial states, they will hide. It won't be present. It won't be present. It would have been removed by the British government because they are, malicious white supremacist thugs. They are thugs, murderous, butchers, racist to the core. They are murderous, butchers, torturers, and enslavers of the third world people. Colonialism was enslavement, for which the third world despises their presence. They're despised by the third world people all over Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So the first place that we talk about British fraudulent history is Chinese colonialism. It's hidden from history. No one knows that Britain carved up China into multiple European colonial provinces, pretending that revenue for Britain came only from Hong Kong, when they raped and plundered the Chinese mainland and stole billions in natural resources for which they refused to pay to today. They introduced opium, they colonized Shanghai, and they helped France colonize southern China to control Indochina and had a monopoly on Chinese products and produced widespread Chinese oppression. The racist British oppressed and starved the Chinese people through their white supremacist colonial butcher action and exploitation and slavery. If we understand the Opium War was a war between Britain and China, which forced the Chinese to sell opium despite outcries and rules against the sale of opium by the Chinese government that were introduced hundreds of years before. They murdered thousands of Chinese in their war of aggression against China in the Opium War. The British also aided the French, Opium War of the Second Opium War to murder more Chinese people. So the racist European colonial butchers and American support of Chiang Kai-shek in mass murder of the Chinese people is an example of their liberation. These are examples of British and American liberation. The British colonial actions in China is an example of liberation. I don't call that liberation for the British government to understand. The white supremacist mafia thugs, this is not liberation. This is neglect. This is exploitation. This is slavery. This is mass murder. This is torture. This is, maliciousness on the part of the British racist government of the, government of Britain. Okay, those are the things. We also talk about, African colonialism and the atrocities. They're lacking. When you look at the media about African colonialism, you'll see nothing of the sort. You won't see any colonial atrocities about South Africa and Africa in general was colonized largely by Great Britain. There is no book about it because they hide it. They're deceitful frauds. When you're not a member of UNESCO, you can speak that you're champions of blacks. You're champions of Africans. They're racist thugs. There's only one championship they have. They're racist champions of slaughter of third world peoples. They don't have anything else to dispute or say. They don't have any rebuttal to the statement that they are champions of racist slaughter. The British government are champions of racist slaughter. Okay? The last place that we're going to talk about is Latin America. Another example is Latin America. Okay, Latin America, they colonized Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela. All of Latin America was colonized by Britain. Nobody knows this history. They don't put it in books. They don't have any books because the British government hides the stuff. They go around the world and ensure that they're not present, and they can, lie and cheat and pretend that Britain is a champion of Hispanics. We don't know about their vicious campaign in Chile, their subjugation and exploitation of the Chilean people. They gave diseases. They created malnutrition. They produced slavery. They were slave drivers in, Chile and Latin America. They stole the oil from Brazil and Chile and Venezuela. They did all sorts of, vicious campaigns of murder, torture, and racist imprisonment of the Chilean, Argentina, Brazilian, and Venezuelan people, for which they think they're champions of Hispanics. They are champions of Hispanic slaughter. The Hispanics despise the British government and the British people because they're racist thugs, mafia, white supremacist thugs. That's what you should know about, British colonial history. So finally, we also wanted to talk about, fraud in the British press. the white supremacist torturers and murderers of the British government committed fraud, their media speech processing computers and fraud. They send the discussions of leaders, but both the American government and the British government do this. They put the media leaders, they put the leaders speeches through computers, and they analyze those speeches, and they find out what the computer says about it, and then they enact subversive actions against international rulers. That's a fact. They've done that in Chile. That was an attack by the U.S. government in Chile, but it has happened multiple times by the British government as well, and the American government. Both have done it. And then we can talk about French colonial rule. French also have committed widespread atrocities for which you will not see books on their, criminal campaigns. A big part of it was Africa. They committed hundreds of atrocities in Africa. They're racist thugs of the French government. They committed hundreds of atrocities in Africa. They also have Pinchard, Lecoutre. These are two French scholars that lied and presented fraudulent information about the Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge of the Cambodian government, and portrayed a genocide and thug-like people when they were just working against American bombing. They're working against the American mass murder campaign that they conducted in Indochina and killed 5 million people in Indochina. They are racist thugs of the French government, the American government, and the British government. So basically, in summary, lies, deceit, and fraud comprise Western media and propaganda. So let's get started. We're going to go through 2 chapters, The Search for Defensible Frontiers, globally and in outer space. Our natural right to subvert. Imperial powers have always good reason for expansion and for repression of the victim nations they conquer and dominate. There is, first of all, the benevolence of conquering power. Roman Catholic Cerealis explained to conquered tribes in Gaul in the 1st century AD that, in contrast with the Germans who entered Gaul out of lust, avarice, and longing for a new home, the Romans came to provide stability and by invitation only. Roman generals and emperors entered your territory as they did the rest of Gaul with no ambitious purposes, but at the solicitation of your ancestors who were wearied by the last extremity by intestine strife. How many battles we have fought against the Cimbri and Teutones, at the cost of what hardships to our armies, and with what result we have waged our German wars is perfectly well known. It was not to defend Italy that we occupied the borders of the Rhine, but to ensure that no second Ariovistus should seize the empire of Gaul. There is, secondly, the need to defend oneself in the enlargement of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most famous phrase is the lexicon of apologetics was the search for defensible frontiers. There were always neighboring states from which dissidents and guerrillas could find refuge and from which they could launch attacks. To preempt this required the conquest and subjugation of the neighboring states, thus establishing a more defensible frontier. This could, of course, rationalize continuous expansion as new neighbors harbored guerrillas. The third good reason that sometimes overlaps with the previous explanation is inadvertence. The imperial power in its blundering efforts to do good or to protect its borders expands. This is the heart of Stanley Kamau's explanation of the U.S. takeover of the Philippines and his account of the Vietnam War, both of which constitute the comprehensive abandonment of serious historiography. Forms of subversion engaged in by the United States in 8 countries in Latin America. We have direct invasion, participation in coups, assassination, sabotage, destabilization, buying politicians and bribery, buying media and media personnel, buying intellectuals, buying labor leaders, black propaganda, lies and rumors, subsidizing student youth, providing military forces for occupation or counterinsurgency. A final good reason for the natural superiority of the expanding country or race is the natural superiority of the expanding country or race. A final good reason. Savages do not put resources to the best use. They do not make deserts bloom, nor do they make forests into deserts. They stand in the way of Übermenschen. Modern imperial powers often conquer neighbors in the old imperial fashion, but they usually leave after a stint of pacification, leaving the neighbor in quote unquote friendly hands. Modern empires also put relatively greater weight on destabilization and subversion of offending governments and the weight and the exercise of indirect control. The United States occasionally invades countries directly, usually to shore up a discredited puppet regime about to fall to indigenous but radical or reformist rule. Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, Lebanon. The invasion of Grenada in 1983 appears to have had a double motive: to stand tall in the wake of the loss of 241 Marines in Beirut, which occurred only days before the incursion, and to take advantage of the disarray following the murder of the head of state, Maurice Bishop, to oust a radical regime. Panama was invaded in 1989 in order to remove Manuel Noriega and reassert U.S. control and to allow George Bush to stand tall. Indirect control of these two former clients was quickly arranged, aided by a modest pacification effort. But the United States has enlarged and protected its domains mainly through subversion, i.e., the undermining of disfavored governments by open and covert hostile actions that weaken their authority and strengthen the power of their enemies. This covers a wide range of activities: boycotts and other forms of economic warfare, bribery and subsidization of politicians, journals and intellectuals, hostile propaganda, sabotage and terror, direct and through proxies, and the encouragement and support of coups. A very important form of subversion has been the wooing, bribing, and brainwashing of foreign police and military personnel who are brought to U.S. facilities in Washington, D.C., Fort Benning, Georgia, etc., where they are treated lavishly, taught to distrust their own people, and made into de facto agents of U.S. power, frequently proving their worth in the vanguard of subsequent coups. The United States has used these methods regularly against governments of which its elite and leadership disapprove. Table 1, reproduced from the Real Terror Network, shows the enormous scope of U.S. subversive activity for 8 Latin American countries up until the early 1980s. The table is surely an understatement, as many of these subversive operations, like bribing journalists, politicians, and military leaders, are hidden from public view and only disclosed on a sporadic and partial basis. Only by reading relatively obscure books would it be possible to find out that in the period leading up to the Brazilian coup of 1964, hundreds of Brazilian politicians had been secretly funded by the U.S. government, or that in the early 1960s, the vice president, minister of labor, son, and physician of the president, and numerous police and intelligence officials and political leaders in Ecuador were on the CIA payroll, among a vast array of equally subversive operations. All these activities would be clearly identified as subversion and fearlessly denounced if engaged in by an alien power. But since they were done by us, different responses follow. First, the word subversion is inapplicable by semantic agreement that no such individuous word could apply to ourselves. Second, the media do a fine job of suppressing or muting evidence of our subversive actions, especially those that are easily rationalized, such as organizing assassinations, bribing foreign politicians, and sponsoring coups against freely elected governments. But the media's greatest achievement lies in normalizing such activities and giving them even a high moral tone. In the trial of Manuel Noriega, the prosecution finally acknowledged that the U.S. government had paid him at least $300,000 for services rendered. But the prosecution claimed that this was not to support his drug dealing. It was merely a payoff for his services as a spy against his own government. This separation is hypocritical, as even if Noriega was paid for spying, his patrons knew about his drug dealing and protection was part of the package. Most importantly, the media reported this admission of bribery of a high officer of a nearby client state very matter-of-factly, essentially reproducing the way information was conveyed by government authorities. There was no indignation and the use and protection of an important agent in the drug trade. By contrast, there was no indignation at the use and protection of an important agent in the drug trade. By contrast, press reports of the arrest of Soviet spies in the United States, Canada, or elsewhere in the free world can barely conceal their indignation. The implication that employing spies, is reprehensible. On hiring spies, even when we have seduced high officials of friendly neighboring countries to betray their own governments, it is even when we have seduced high officials of friendly neighboring countries to betray their own governments, is passed through the prism of doublethink and treated differently, as is our and their shooting down of civilian airliners. A 1976 report disclosed that the United States had been involved in at least a dozen attempts to murder Fidel Castro. There is also substantial evidence that we engaged in or sponsored a large number of acts of sabotage against Cuban property, that our Cuban refugee proxies committed numerous acts of terrorist violence against Cuba, including the blowing up of a civilian airliner, and that we have even employed chemical and biological agents against Cuban crops and farm animals. If Castro had done similar things, they would have cited regularly as definitive proof of his terroristic and subversive proclivities, as if he or Gaddafi had printed a terrorist manual, such as the CIA wrote for the Contras in Nicaragua. The government media and quote-unquote experts would have a field day with such solid evidence confirming his or Gaddafi's terrorist qualities. As it is, the Western experts never cite the Contra manual and its application as a case study in terrorist processes, although it provides an outstanding model. The mainstream media mainly ignored these major acts of terror or treated them antiseptically as isolated incidents or blunders. Not as evidence of criminal and terrorist activity. There was even a generous dollop of apologetics in uncritical reporting of official denials, alleged provocations, and references to security threats. Castro and Gaddafi revealed their true natures by questionable acts. The United States is provoked at most errs and gives the enemies grist for propaganda. The search for honest quislings. Because the U.S. role in the Third World has been primarily to shore up the old order, the colonial order, preserving the huge traditional inequalities of wealth and foreign privilege in the face of challenges from below, it has regularly aligned itself with local oligarchs and military leaders of unsavory character who organized what the National Liberation Front of Vietnam called country-selling governments. In South Vietnam, in order to find leaders willing to front for a foreign invader and preside over the U.S. destruction of their land and people, the United States eventually had to resort to mercenaries who had fought for the French, were somewhat dim in intelligence, and were thieves and drug dealers. In country after country over the past half century, the United States has organized governments run by scoundrels who would do the necessary dirty work. The list is impressive. The old Chiang Kai-shek clique, the rapacious and former collaborationist military leaders of Thailand, Argentina, and Chilean generals, the Shah of Iran, the Indonesian generals, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Stroessner in Paraguay, the Guatemalan generals, Mobutu in Zaire. Our favorite collaborationists tend to be crooks as well as murderers. And because of the corruption endemic in these U.S.-sponsored governments, they have been called shakedown states. This has led numerous establishment intellectuals and pundits to remark on moral deficiencies of backward peoples and to trace the roots to the problem of Asian, African, and Latin American, quote-unquote, human nature. The idea that there could be a pernicious selectivity at work, that the West sought out the dregs by preference, and that Western influence was itself corrupting, was, of course, an unacceptable line of thought. In regard to South Vietnam, Malcolm Brown regretfully observed in 1964, unfortunately, most of the really intelligent, dedicated, and patriotic men and women who formed the stuff of sound leadership stayed with the Viet Minh. Most of them, however, were eventually killed by U.S. military forces or by local mercenaries in Operation Phoenix or similar death squad operations. No generalizations based on such information about the aborting or crippling of alternate paths of development can be found in the Western media. Moderates and extremists. The quote unquote leaders put in place to serve U.S. power are invariably labeled moderates by the U.S. mass media. This follows by definition from the fact that they are supported by the U.S. government and serve U.S. interests. U.S. officials treat them as reasonable people we can work with and suggest that any little unpleasantness in which they may have recently indulged are under review and will be corrected soon under our tutelage. That is, they will do our bidding, kill only the right people, and allow foreign investment and sales, even if at a heavy price, in a corruption drain, quote unquote. Indonesian head of state, General Subandro Suharto, for example, came into power on the wave of an outburst of terrorism that involved the slaughter of between 500,000 and 1 million people, mostly landless peasants. He and his coterie are also conquerors for honors as the greatest thieves in history. But Suharto terminated any populist or radical threat to control of Indonesia, and he has maintained an open door to U.S. investment and served as a staunch U.S. ally. Despite the mass slaughter, he has therefore been treated by the U.S. political and corporate leadership as a fine fellow, as has the media and intellectual community. Thus, the Christian Science Monitor of February 6, 1987, referred to Suharto as a quote-unquote moderate leader and, quote, stability that Suharto brought to Indonesia, acknowledging extreme corruption and serious human rights violations only in passing. General Videla and Viola, Argentine leaders during the Holocaust of 1976 to 1983, were regularly referred to by the New York Times as quote-unquote moderates with, quote, democratic leanings. In 1933, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Berlin communicated to Washington that hope for U.S. interests lay in the more moderate section of the Nazi Party, headed by Hitler himself, which appeals to all civilized and reasonable people and appeared to have the upper hand over violent extremists. The tone emphasized in treating these client-state killers is always low-keyed, and their motives are seen as benevolent. The London Economist described Suharto at heart benign. And the New York Times wrote, what is in doubt is not General Videla's good intentions, but these publications. What is in doubt is not General Videla's good intentions, but these publications never impute benign hearts nor good intentions on leaders of enemy states, such as Daniel Ortega or Fidel Castro. Such individuals are invariably treated with sarcasm and sneers, their motives suspect. The difference is based completely on political bias sustained by selective reporting. Following the propaganda lead of their government, the media commonly establish the moderateness of client state leaders by claiming that the quote-unquote moderates in high office are regrettably unable to control the extremists under and affiliated with them, who seem to be doing a great deal of killing. The violence is ascribed to a tragic battle between extreme leftists and extreme rightists, with our friendly government officials in the middle. The extreme rightists may be government agents, either members of the armed forces or of death squads, often composed of past or present members of the armed forces. But in the government media version, the moderates in the government do not condone these murders and are striving to improve things. We must therefore support them in their struggle to control their subordinates and agents. This droll exercise in apologetics was evident in the Times editorials and news reports on Argentina. In the editorial cited above, General Videla and the officers who surround him held out for a more moderate course. There is no evidence that he and the other members of the ruling junta condoned the recent military excesses. What is in doubt is not General Videla's good intentions, but his ability to control military men driven by obsessions. The apologetics for state terror, which is repeated in other editorials and is manifest in the news coverage, was never supported by evidence. It resulted from taking at face value the self-serving statements of Argentine and U.S. officials, just as a Soviet journalist might have reported, without question, a claim by Stalin that the ongoing killings and torture grieved him and were carried out by subordinates out of control and obsessed with the fascist and Western imperialist threat. In 1980, Amnesty International report exposing the 60 Argentine detention centers in which torture was carried out and which linked the death squads to the military establishment was never found newsworthy by the New York Times. News selection and suppression complement and service the acceptance of propaganda for friendly terror. The government and media employed the same apologetic frame for state terror in El Salvador in the 1980s. Here, Jose Napoleon Duarte was the moderate head of the moderate junta, unable to contain the extremes of right and left. The death squads were rightist, out of control, like the Argentinian army. There was once again implausible and fraudulent. This was once again implausible and fraudulent, as most of the killing was done by the Salvadoran army, and the death squads were a controlled and protected affiliate of the army. Duarte was a powerful fig leaf who gave the impression of moderateness by an earlier history that was irrelevant to his performance and role in the 1980s, but which was reported without question by the mainstream media. Subsequently, Alfredo Cristiani played the same role as frontman for the extreme right-wing Arena Party, founded by Robert Duaubusson. As he served U.S. power, the nominal power and fig leaf role were once again noted. Cristiani was a moderate by the fact of his service and acceptability to U.S. officials. The long record of media apologetics that has made any servant of U.S. power a moderate has left only one question remaining. Is there any limit to the scoundrelism that would cause an individual supported by the U.S. government to be identified as a moderate in the U.S. press, question mark? No limit is observable as yet. When Robert Duaubusson came near to becoming president of El Salvador in 1982, U.S. officials began to stress the variety within the Arena Party, the doctrine of changing course, and the importance of giving people a chance. Ambassador Hinton said that anyone who believes in the democratic system should give him, Duaubusson, the benefit of the doubt. The press began to accommodate as well. In 1982 interview with the Mexican paper El Dia, in which Duaubusson lauded the Germans for their efficiency in handling the Jewish problem, was suppressed. An article by Warren Hodge in the Times of April 1st, 1982, captures the new look of a fascist in the process of becoming a rightist flag bearer. He's accompanied by flatteringly thoughtful picture of Duaubusson, and an article criticizes him gently for his impulsiveness and desire for confrontation and the fact that his behavior is uneven. Staged elections as a control device. The United States has mastered the art of staging elections in third world client states as a means of assuring the home populace that a U.S. interventionary process is meritorious and serves a higher purpose. These demonstration elections are fraudulent in their very essence for the following reasons. They are organized by a foreign power as a public relations effort to ratify the rule of local authorities satisfactory to the foreign power. Where elections will not yield the desired results, perhaps because the local environment cannot be controlled, as in Vietnam in 1956, the United States avoids them. They are usually held after a stint of military occupation and pacification and under conditions of ongoing state terror, which weakens and decimates the oppositional forces, leaves the voting population fearful and traumatized, and allows the loyalists, quote unquote, to control the machinery of elections. Put otherwise, the main conditions of a free election, freedom of speech, assembly, and press, freedom of intermediate organizations to mobilize people, freedom of all factions to put up candidates, and the absence of fear and terror among the populace have never been even approximated in U.S. staged demonstration elections in Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, and El Salvador. Even beyond these considerations, the intervention of a powerful outsider by its very nature alters the parameters of an election by the biasing effect of massive deployments of foreign money and propaganda, and by the need of indigenous parties and the populace to placate the intruder. Although these points are quite obvious, the U.S. demonstration of elections in South Vietnam in 1966 to 1967, and in the Dominican Republic in 1966, and in El Salvador in 1982 and later, and the Guatemalan elections of 1984 to 1985 were extraordinarily successful because the U.S. mass media handled them like a propaganda agency of the government. The government said, in fact, focus on long lines of voters and smiling faces, stress the size of the turnout, and don't discuss freedom of the press, free speech, and decimation of dissident organizations, the inability of rebels to participate, and the state terror and fear. Emphasize procedural fairness and avoid substance. In accord with this call by the government, Stephen Kinzer quoted the independent observers of the International Human Rights Law Group on the Guatemalan elections of 1984 to the effect that the election was procedurally fair, but ignored their repeated observation that the population was in a state of permanent fear. It was pointed out in the preface that in connection with the Nicaraguan election of 1984, the mass media, again following the lead of the government, simply reversed agendas, forgot about procedural fairness, and concerned themselves with freedom of the press, the ability of an opposition to run, and the like. As we noted, this pushes us to the limits of doublethink and doublespeak, using different criteria for demonstration elections and those opposed by their governments, and even misrepresenting facts within the framework of double standards. The mass media duplicated this feat in their coverage of the Nicaraguan election of 1990. Their view, without exception, was that Mrs. Chamorro and UNO beat Ortega and the Sandinistas in a free and fair election, marred only by Sandinista abuses. It was repeatedly stated that this was the first free election in Nicaraguan history, the basis for the claim being that Reagan administration had declared the 1984 election a quote-unquote sham, which was therefore an established truth for the free press. The fact that Latin American Studies Association Observer Team described the 1984 election as a model of fairness by Latin American standards, and that Lord Chitnis, representing the British parliamentary group, had found it superior to the Salvadoran election of the same year, had no impact on the mainstream media. These authorities came to the wrong conclusions, and their messages were therefore simply not reported. For David Binder, the Chamorro victory in the 1990 election was a payoff for U.S. quote-unquote patience in pursuing the electoral option. The decade-long U.S.-sponsored terror and economic warfare was written out of history and was not mentioned by him as the primary area in which the United States has displayed both diligence and patience. In the real world, the U.S. attack, which devastated the Nicaraguan economy, were certainly primary contributor to the fall in per capita income of over 50% between 1980 and 1990. It seems obvious, therefore, that the United States had purposely tilted the playing field in a direction unfavorable to the ruling party. It is a cliche in U.S. politics that parties in power are punished by the voters for poor economic performance. The U.S. media never assessed this deliberate creation of an unlevel playing field and its bearing on the outcome of fairness of the elections. The massive intervention of the United States in funding opposition groups and parties and engaging in numerous manipulative activities in Nicaragua was mentioned only briefly, if at all, and was never suggested that this was a gross infringement on Nicaraguan sovereignty or affected the election results. That similar intervention by foreigners in a U.S. election would be illegal was never mentioned. The only suggestions of possible unfairness were found in the Sandinista control of the army and election machinery, which for the New York Times made the Sandinistas a Goliath, quote unquote, in relation to the U.S.-supported coalition. Finally, the failure of the United States to dismantle the Contra army in accord with Tela agreement left that terrorist force in place to resume operations if Mrs. Chamorro lost. President Bush told Mrs. Chamorro publicly that the boycotts would end if UNO was victorious. There was thus every reason to believe that if Goliath triumphed, economic and proxy terrorist warfare would continue. Nicaraguan voters therefore cast ballots under conditions of blackmail, vote for Chamorro and UNO, or suffer further superpower attack. The point was never made in the mainstream media. The Nicaraguan people finally said uncle, quote unquote, after a decade of terrorism and boycott, and over 50% reduction of income, and a blackmail threat at the moment of voting in 1990. That the US media could trumpet this as a triumph of democracy is beyond hypocrisy. Terrorism and retaliation. One of the most potent weapons of the Western establishment designed to justify beating up smaller countries is the need for defense against quote unquote terrorism. The terrorist is a fearsome symbol, conjuring up visions of a bewhiskered, foreign-featured bomb thrower threatening Western white, quote unquote, white, not quote, Western white innocents. Like national security, terrorism is a fuzzy notion that can be employed with great indignation against selected enemies while ignoring, supporting, and carrying out similar actions by ourselves and allies. This can be accomplished only if a cooperative media will not look closely, ask questions, and challenge double standards and propagandist usage. And the US mass media have been even more than cooperative. The use of this propaganda weapon has been greatly aided by the rise of an industry devoted to producing and disseminating the West's selective version of terrorism. The industry consists of government officials, terrorism experts, houses in, and funded by government-related and corporate-funded think tanks and private security firms. These experts and security firm personnel work for governments and corporations who have their own narrow views of terrorists. Salvadoran peasants, Chilean workers, and South African blacks would have a different view, but they don't have the resources to fund think tanks, experts, and databases listing terrorist incidents. The funded experts respond to their funders' demands, and not surprisingly, it turns out that the West is defending against terrorism, not terrorizing, that Libya and North Korea are terrorist states, not El Salvador, South Africa, or Israel. On February 2nd, 1988, FBI Chief William Sessions told the press that the surveillance of CISPAS has been legitimate because it had badly given support to a quote-unquote terrorist organization, namely the FMLN rebels of El Salvador. In any rebellion, force is used. By Sessions' logic, George Washington's army was a terrorist organization. If we consider, as we obviously should, who initiated the violence, whether the rebels had explored political options before resorting to arms, and the forms and levels of violence and intimidation, the evidence is clear that in El Salvador, state terror came first and on a large scale, that the political options were entirely foreclosed before the armed rebellion developed. As Archbishop Romero told President Carter in 1980, the people's organizations are fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. And in his diary, he noted that the opposition forces were being subject to a general program of annihilation to which they were responding. Given these considerations, the FMLN should not be regarded as a terrorist organization at all. It is more reasonably described as engaged in self-defense, quote unquote, and counter-terrorism against the Salvadoran state and its external U.S. managers, who are the real terrorists. How does the propaganda system obscure the evidence that the Salvadoran state terrorizes and that the United States, as the organizer, protector, and supplier of this regime, is an international terrorist state, question mark, partly by arbitrary and highly political word manipulation, and partly by brazen government media doctoring of evidence. An important element of word manipulation is the confinement of terrorism to acts of violence and intimidation carried out by individuals and small groups. Dictionary definitions have always extended the reach of the word to government, and in recent years gone by, terrorism was associated primarily with governments. This was based on the quantity and quality of violence carried out by state and non-state actors, as only states use systematic torture as a method of intimidation, and the scale of their acts of violence makes the terrorism of individuals and small groups look relatively insignificant. The concept of real and wholesale terrorism capture the fact that individual and rebel group violence is on small retail scale, whereas state violence is on a large wholesale scale. The shift to using quote-unquote terrorism only for small-scale violence was a highly political choice of word use, corresponding to an identifiable political agenda. In 1981, President Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander Haig announced that they were shifting U.S. priorities from quote-unquote human rights to quote-unquote terrorism. Human rights policies were concerned with the abusive activities of states like Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and South Africa. These countries were already receiving muted attention given their client status, but Reagan was actually entering into alliances with these agents of wholesale terrorism, all of whom greeted his accession to the presidency with enthusiasm. The point of the newly invigorated concern over retail terrorism was partly to divert attention from the now constructively engaged state terrorists who were unleashed to invade and kill on a larger scale in Lebanon, South Africa, and Central America, and partly to justify other Reagan-era policies, rearmament and upward redistribution of income, etc., which required a patriotic, confused, and therefore more manageable public. The media went along with these new priorities and the related system of doublespeak and propaganda about terrorism without notable dissent. Confining terrorism, quote unquote, to the acts of retail terrorists is sometimes rationalized on the ground that they attack innocent civilians, whereas state terrorists are presumably more discriminating. While this stance is made plausible by airline hijackings and airport bombings, it is a false generalization. Real terrorists are often highly selective, and state terrorists frequently engage in deliberate intimidation by murder of large civilian populations. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, NLF, for example, punished catters who victimize untargeted civilians. On the other hand, B-52 bombing raids in Vietnam and Israeli bombing attacks on heavily populated areas were and are well understood as efforts to victimize non-combatants. After Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin had criticized earlier labor governments for indiscriminate attack on Arab civilians in response to attacks on his own policies, Labor Party spokesperson Abba Eban defended the earlier bombings on the grounds that there was a rational prospect, ultimately fulfilled, that afflicted populations, innocent civilians, deliberately bombed would exert pressure from the cessation of hostilities. In other words, the intent of Israeli bombing has been to intimidate the civilian population into pressing their leaders to alter their policy. This is a convention of planned, indiscriminate murder of civilians. Another important doublespeak evidence device for rationalizing one's own and friendly terrorism is to describe it as quote-unquote retaliation or quote-unquote counter-terror. The trick here is arbitrary word assignment. That is, any violence engaged in ourselves or by ourselves or our friends is ipso facto retaliation and counter-terrorism. Whatever the enemy does is terrorism, irrespective of facts. Of course, the enemy always says that his violence was provoked by prior acts of ours and our clients that he designates as terrorists. But the enemy claims are never allowed. Our claims and those of our allies are never questioned. When the Israelis bombed Tunis on October 1st, 1985, killing some 55 Palestinians and 20 Tunisian bystanders, the Reagan administration and Western press found that this was quote-unquote retaliation for prior PLO actions, but the PLO's explanation that its acts were based on earlier Israeli acts was inadmissible. Word assignment based purely on political preference is doublespeak in action. The Orwellian quality of this selective argument with the words terrorist and retaliation is highlighted by the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the sequence of violence and by factual background of that invasion. The official Israeli, U.S., and Western media formulation is that the invasion was designed to eliminate quote-unquote pockets of terrorism. But the invasion took place after a period in which PLO had successfully maintained a ceasefire on the borders of Israel for 11 months, despite Israeli provocation. This caused consternation among the Israeli leadership because it made it hard for them to use the claim of quote-unquote terrorism to refuse to negotiate a political settlement. On June 25th, 1982, the Israeli analyst of the PLO, Yehoshua Porath, wrote in Haaretz that the decision of the government, or more precisely its leaders, to invade Lebanon flowed from the very fact that the ceasefire had been observed. He went on to say, the government's hope is that following the invasion, the stricken PLO, lacking a logistical and territorial base, will return to its earlier terrorism, which will carry out bombings throughout the world, hijack airplanes, and murder many Israelis. In this way, the PLO will lose part of the political legitimacy it has gained, undercutting the danger that elements will develop among the Palestinians that might become a legitimate negotiating partner for future political accommodations. In short, the Israeli leadership wanted and deliberately provoked PLO terrorism, quote unquote, to justify a refusal to negotiate. This makes the Israeli invasion a major act of terrorism. The latter PLO acts responsible and induced by the plan. But in Western ideology and the Western media, this does not alter the rule. Israel only retaliates, the PLO engages in terrorism. We can see that the use of doublespeak by arbitrary word assignment is bolstered by and even requires a refusal to look at current and historical facts. Fact suppression is extremely important to doublespeak in general. Israel and the Palestinians. The Middle East, and especially the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, has yielded a cornucopia of doublespeak usage. This is a result of the huge gap between Western media, between Western pretensions and nominal values on the one hand, and Western interests and policies on the other. Israeli governments have absolutely refused to do any political business with the Palestinians for decades and have carried out policies toward Palestinian and Israel that have regularly compared in the Israeli and world, but not the U.S. press, to those of South Africa. Doublespeak of the Middle East is also greatly affected by the power of the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. In addition to its virtually unconditional support for Israeli actions, the Jewish establishment has abused and threatened retaliations against intellectuals, journalists, and politicians who voice criticism of Israeli policy or who support any kind of challenge, penalty, or restriction on aid to the Israeli state. Although the Jewish lobby is not a large one, its resources and connections, the commitment of its supporters, and its ties to the military-industrial complex make it potent, and political candidates vie with one another in vows of fealty to Israel. For the Jewish establishment itself, there appears to be no limits to Israeli violence against unarmed civilians that will not be rationalized by alleged quote-unquote provocations. And if the beatings and the cracking of the bones of women and children are acceptable, what next for the two-legged animals, quote-unquote, and quote-unquote grasshoppers? Why, with the effective cowing of many of the politicians, intellectuals, journalists, and editors who are not already true believers, the stage is set for the institutionalization of myths, big lies, and doublespeak. Many of the myths center in the origins of the Israeli state and the basis for the exodus of Palestinians that follows, which are beyond the scope of this discussion. The concept of terrorism, quote unquote, which has been central to the Israeli effort to dehumanize the Palestinians and provide the basis for refusal to negotiate a political settlement, has been discussed in the previous section. Rejectionism and super rejectionism. In parallel with the usage on terrorism, in Western doublespeak, the Israeli state and the United States never reject, only the enemy does. The treatment is humorous given the facts of the case. The New York Times asked whether the PLO can step into the diplomatic breach as an acceptable negotiating partner with Israel, and answers yes if it renounces terror and its sterile rejectionism. Otherwise, Israel would not find the courage to go on to the negotiating table with an organization formally dedicated to the destruction. If we ask why the stronger party shall lack courage, but the weaker one whose existence is not even recognized by the stronger should be obliged to muster up the courage, the Times offers no answer. Note the Times mention of the Palestinian quote-unquote formal dedication to Israel's destruction, which permits it to avoid addressing the fact that in January 1976, and periodically thereafter, the PLO accepted a quote-unquote practical proposal for a two-state settlement that amounted to de facto recognition and guarantees of Israeli security and sovereignty. In an editorial a month later, the Times berated Mr. Arafat for preserving his rejectionism, noting that heading to a November 1st election, Israeli politicians seemed lost in a wilderness of slogans. Editorial September 9th, 1988. On one side, straightforward rejectionism, on the other, simple confusion. In the same editorial, the Times acknowledged that Shamir has said that he will never even talk to the PLO, and that Perez engages in his own evasive double talk. As noted earlier, Israeli analysts even explained the 1982 Lebanon invasion in terms of the Israeli leadership's fear that Arafat's control over terrorism would force unwanted negotiations. The Israeli leadership has also shown exceptional hostility to Israelis and Palestinians who hint at the possibility and desirability of mutual recognition. But for some unexplained reason, Israeli super rejectionism never designated sterile rejectionism, quote unquote, and the burden of successfully opening a diplomatic track is always on the PLO. The insufficiency of these hesitant feelers of the weaker party in the face of super rejectionism is the entire focus of attention as rejectionism. This is beyond hypocrisy. The peace process, quote unquote. The Camp David Accords introduced, at least for the Western media, something called a peace process. This enduring phrase tells us that in the Western view, the agreements were a quote unquote good thing. In fact, the Camp David Agreement successfully pulled Egypt out of effective opposition to Israeli policies, thereby giving Israel a freer hand, but without resolving in any way the underlying Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Furthermore, while the Accords called for negotiations among Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and representatives of the Palestinian on the status of the Israeli-held territories, the Israeli Knesset quickly voted that after the transition period, it would act to fulfill its rights to sovereignty over Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district, thus negating the agreement to negotiate. The ensuing settlement program in the occupied territories, internal repression, and continuous warfare indicates that the peace process actually facilitated a more efficient war process. The clear failure of the courts to advance peace has not interfered in any way with the Western usage, a good thing that deserves a warm phrase, quote unquote, peace process. Anti-Semitism. With Israel's increased power and aggressiveness, its enlarged role as a Western enforcer against the lesser breeds of the Middle East, and its utility as a surrogate arms supplier of South Africa, Somoza, the Nicaraguan Contras, Guatemala, Honduras, and pre-Alfonso in Argentina, the attitude of traditional anti-Semites towards Israel has changed. In 1965, in 67, Xavier Vallet, who was responsible for thousands of Jewish deportations to the death camps at the Minister of Jewish Affairs under the Vichy regime, wrote an article in the right-wing French newspaper Aspects de la Franca, explaining that he was now a Zionist, Mes missions d'etre sioniste, June 15, 1967, and expressing his support for Israel in its struggle against the Arabs. This fascist was effusive over the Jewish people's discovery of its nationality and their ethnic religious tendency to domination, a tendency dominates. Many other leaders of the radical right have flocked to the support of Israel. Arguably, this is because the dominant Israeli quote-unquote Semites are westernized and are keeping their place in the more backward and troublesome Semites. The Israelis merits approval in the same way that Duarte, Sadat, Generals Stu and Kai, Savimbi and their cadres, armies and police do for their service to Western interests. A shift in attitudes towards Semites has accompanied these new relationships, and Western contempt and hatred has been largely displaced from the former victims to the more threatening Semites of the latest set of victims. The change is hardly recognized in the West. Anti-Semitism is a word applied only to attitudes towards former victims, now integrated into Western power structures. The hostility in the West to Arab Semites is never described as anti-Semitism, and many of the right-wing friends of Israel haven't slowed off their traditional anti-Semitism and dislike of Jews. Thus, Jerry Falwell mounts traditional anti-Semitic sentiments easily and frequently, but loves and supports Israel and is honored and fitted here. There is he an anti-Semite in the transvaluation of values of the Jewish establishment in the United States, certainly for its large right-wing contingent. The usage of the word anti-Semitism has suddenly shifted from hostility, hatred, and stereotyped attitudes towards Jews to criticism and hostility toward Israel. Nixon's classic anti-Semitic utterances revealed on his tapes, Reagan's incredible performance at the Nazi cemetery of Bitburg, Argentine state anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the Christian and radical right, and even the revelation of official U.S. protection and patronage of Nazi murderers after World War II, all are treated benignly by the media because these traditional manifestations of anti-Semitism are combined with support of Israel. Meanwhile, Jesse Jackson's reference to the Jewish areas as Jaime towns is serious business because Jackson is not a supporter of Israel. In the world of establishment doublespeak, anti-Semitism has become first and foremost Criticism and hostility to Israel. Traditional anti-Semitism is of lesser importance, used strategically to designate those who display the really important failing. So that's it. That's that chapter. The search for defensible frontiers. So let's get some comments made here. It's an important chapter. We understand. So the British Empire, we talked first about the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most famous phrase in the lexicon of apologetics was the search for defensible frontiers. There were always neighboring states from which dissidents and guerrillas could find refuge and from which they could launch strikes. To preempt this required the conquest and subjugation of the neighboring states, thus establishing a more defensible frontier. So that's how the British colonial, mafia, white supremacist thugs went around. They colonized, for instance, China, and then they, moved into Hong Kong. They colonized, in South Africa, and they moved into Namibia. These kinds of things are British government, mafia thugs, the racist thugs of the British government, racist thugs. So continuing on, we talked a lot about, all of the different approaches the U.S. government uses to subversion, the forms of subversion. We talked about it in all of their client states in Latin America. So, but the greatest, okay, so we also talked about, we also talked about the media do a fine job of suppressing or muting evidence of our subversive actions, especially those that are less easily rationalized, such as organizing assassinations, bribing foreign politicians, and sponsoring coups against freely elected governments. The word subversion is inapplicable by semantic agreement that no such invidious word could apply to ourselves. So when we say subversion, we don't apply it to ourselves. That's the U.S. government approach to colonial, imperialism and colonialism is, subversion is not something that the U.S. does. Again, they're white supremacist mafia thugs, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. So the media's greatest achievement lies in normalizing such activities and giving them high moral value. In the trial of Manuel Noriega, the prosecution finally acknowledged that the U.S. government had paid him at least $300,000 for services rendered. But the prosecution claimed that this was not to support his drug dealing. It was merely as a payoff for services as a spy against his own government. The separation is hypocritical, as even if Noriega was paid for spying, his patrons knew about his drug dealing, and protection was part of the package. Most importantly, the media reported this admission of bribery of a high officer of a nearby client state, very matter-of-factly, essentially reproducing the way the information was conveyed by government authorities. There was no indignation at the use and protection of an important agent in the drug trade. By contrast, press reports of the arrest of Soviet spies in the United States, Canada, or elsewhere in the free world can barely conceal their indignation. The implication that employing spies is reprehensible. Our hiring spies, even when we have seduced high officials of friendly neighboring countries to betray their own governments, is passed through the prism of doublethink and treated as differently as ours, with ours shooting down of civilian airlines. So you can see it's doublethink, it's hypocrisy, it's, white supremacist frauds. They're frauds, they're liars, they're murderous butchers. When it applies to the United States, the propagandists, the government handouts of the U.S. mass media, support the party line that Noriega, we bribed him. But it's okay to bribe. Like when Uncle Sam bribes, it's okay. But when, the Soviet Union bribes, it's not okay. This is a racist group of hypocritical frauds, deceitful liars, dishonest, corrupt, negligent, malicious, racist, white supremacists. That is the U.S. government. The search for honest quislings. All right, so because the U.S. role in the Third World has been primarily shore up the old order, preserving the huge traditional inequalities of wealth and foreign privilege in the face of challenges from below, it has regularly aligned itself with local oligarchs and military leaders of an unsavory character who organized what the NLF of Vietnam called country-selling governments in South Vietnam in order to find leaders willing to front for a foreign invader and preside over the U.S. destruction of their land and people. The United States eventually had to resort to mercenaries who had fought for the French were somewhat dim in intelligence and were thieves and drug dealers. In country after country over the past century, the United States has organized governments run by scoundrels who would do the necessary dirty work. The list is impressive. The old Chiang Kai-shek clique, the rapacious and former collaborationist military leaders of Thailand, Argentine and Chilean generals, the Shah of Iran, the Indonesian generals, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Stroessner in Paraguay, the Guatemalan generals, Mobutu in Zaire. Our favorite collaborationists tend to be crooks as well as murderers. And because corruption endemic in these U.S.-sponsored governments is present, they have been called quote unquote shakedown states. So basically, it's basically anything goes for the United States. Any scoundrel is okay as long as he's loyal to the U.S. government. Thugs, they're white supremacists. Thugs, racist thugs, murderers, butchers, negligent, dishonest, immature, undisciplined, and irresponsible white supremacist thugs of the U.S. government. That's what they are. Dishonest, immature and irresponsible, negligent thugs. So, moderates and extremists. We talked about moderates and extremists. So, the leaders put in place to serve U.S. power are invariably labeled moderates, quote unquote, by the U.S. mass media. This follows from the definition that they are supported by the U.S. government and serve U.S. interests. U.S. officials treat them as reasonable people we can work with and suggest that any little unpleasantness in which they may have recently indulged are under review and will be corrected soon under our tutelage. That is, they will do our bidding, kill only the right people, and allow foreign investment and sales, even if at a high price, in a corruption drain. So now Indonesian head of state General Subandro Suharto or Haj Suharto, for example, came into power on the wave of an outburst of terrorism that involved the slaughter of between 500,000 and 1 million people, mostly landless, present. He and his coterie are also contenders for honors as the greatest thieves in history. But Suharto terminated any populist or radical threat to control Indonesia, and he has maintained an open door to U.S. investment and served as a staunch U.S. ally. Despite the mass slaughter, he has therefore been treated by the U.S. political and corporate leadership as a fine fellow, as has the media and intellectual community. Thus, the Christian Science Monitor, that prestigious American newspaper, on February 6, 1987, referred to Suharto as a quote unquote moderate leader. And Michael Leifer, writing the Liberal World Policy Journal, featured the stability of Suharto brought to Indonesia, acknowledging extreme corruption and serious human rights violations only in passing. General Videla and Viola, Argentine leaders during the Holocaust of 1976 to 1983, were regularly referred by the New York Times as quote-unquote moderates and democratic leaning. In 1933, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires of Berlin communicated to Washington the hope for U.S. interests lay in more moderate sections of the Nazi Party, headed by Hitler himself, which appeals to all civilized and reasonable people and appear to have upper hand over violent extremists. So you can see the negligent, racist, negligent, dishonest, corrupt, irresponsible, immature, white supremacists of the U.S. government. This is what they do. They support Suharto, General Suharto, a mass murderer and a mass torture of his people. And they let him get away with murder against the third world people of Asia because they are murderous butchers. They're white supremacists, murderous butchers. So continuing on, we had, the scoundrelism. We talked about scoundrelism. So we talked about General Videla. We should understand General Videla of Argentina. Okay, the droll exercise in apologetics. Basically, we must therefore support any of the dictators in their struggle to control their subordinates and agents. This droll exercise in apologetics was evident in the Times editorial and news reports in Argentina in the editorials cited above. General Videla and the officers surround him held out for a more moderate cause. There is no evidence that he and other members of the ruling junta condoned the recent military excesses. What is in doubt is not General Videla's good intentions, but his ability to control military men driven by obsessions. That's the way you do it. You just apologize for General Videla. This apologetic for state terror, which is repeated in other editorials and manifest in the quote unquote news coverage, was never supported by evidence. It resulted from taking at face value the self-serving statements of Argentina and U.S. officials, just as a Soviet journalist might have reported without question a claim by Stalin that the ongoing killings and torture grieved him and were carried out by subordinates out of control and obsessed with the fascist and Western imperialist threat. So just put it into your own thing. Again, the same thing. Irresponsible, immature, negligent, racist, murderous, butcher, white supremacists of the U.S. government. Corrupt to the core, racist to the core, evil to the core, and negligent, immature, undisciplined, and dishonest white supremacists. So continuing on, we talk here about staged elections as a control device. Okay, the U.S. demonstration elections in 1966 to 1967 in South Vietnam, the Dominican Republic in 1966, and in El Salvador in 1982 and later, and the Guatemalan elections of 1984 to 1985 were extraordinarily successful because U.S. mass media handled them like a propaganda agency of the government. The government said, in effect, focus on long lines of voters and smiling faces, stress the size of the turnout, and don't discuss freedom of the press, free speech, and decimation of dissident organizations, the inability of the rebels to participate, and state terror and fear, emphasize procedural fairness, and avoid substance. In accord with this call by the government, Stephen Kinzer, Pulitzer Prize-winning fraud of the New York Times, quoted the independent observers of the International Human Rights Law Group on the Guatemala election of 1984 to the effect that the election was procedurally fair, but ignored the repeated observation that the population was in a state of permanent fear. So, basically the Nicaraguan election, the opposite, right? The Sandinistas trying to make as much good democracy as possible. Reagan just, lies. And the fraud, white, corporate media, the racist media of the U.S. government, its mass media follows right in line with the party line. Again, the U.S. white supremacists are negligent. They are dishonest. They are immature. They're irresponsible. They're undisciplined. And they are frauds. So continuing on, so we talked about it, we talked a little bit about retaliation and terrorism. So we're going to just head on to the next chapter. Repelling naked aggression and upholding the sanctity of international law in the Persian Gulf. President George Bush and his administration have devoted primary attention to external matters, first in Panama, then for a more extended period and with vastly greater attention and resources to the Gulf War and its aftermath. Interestingly, at the same time as Bush was proving in daily headlines that he could stand as tall as his great mentor, there was also daily headlines describing terrible and worsening problems in the United States. New York State and City suffer acute fiscal crises. Philadelphia is struggling to avoid bankruptcy. And while these and numerous other cities and states are forced to make drastic cutbacks in services, urban poverty, decay, crime, and drug crises continue unabated or worsen. The Bush administration's neglect of education and infrastructure while diverting capital and technology into war-making continued Reagan-era policies that seem deliberately designed to undermine long-term productivity and competitiveness. Bush preoccupation with the Gulf brings to mind Mrs. Jelby in Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House. Mrs. Jelby spent her greatest energies organizing other do-gooders to help and straighten out the poor natives of Boribola, Ga in Africa, while her own family was neglected, resentful, and pathetic. A difference between Mrs. Jelby and George Bush as models of misplaced priorities, however, is that Mrs. Jelby meant well and at least did not seriously harm the recipients of her ill-conceived charity. The contradiction between domestic conditions and the diversion of leadership and material resources to war-making was occasionally noted in the mainstream media in the immediate aftermath of the war. Some liberal pundits boldly suggest that if we could mobilize so exhaustively to contain naked aggression, we might do the same for domestic problems. But generally, the political success of the bipartisan war and the power of the war party kept such views muted. We were number one again, and what more could a free people ask? It took the better part of a year after the end of the war for U.S. politics to be reoriented towards its massive domestic problems, which included a recession that had begun in July 1990 and showed no signs of terminating by the end of 1991. Quote, another Hitler. Whenever the U.S. establishment pushes somebody to the top of its list and wishes to mobilize the public for a program of destabilization and aggression, a demonization campaign is unleashed. For the Reagan replacement of the concern over human rights with terrorism as the heart and soul of U.S. foreign policy in 1981, Gaddafi was brought in online. He was a perfect foil, dark-skinned Arab, anti-Israel, supporter of national liberation movements, inclined to rhetorical excesses, and a sponsor of terrorists, although hardly competitive with the United States and South Africa in this respect. And his emergence as a symbol of evil is a classic case of government-press collaboration for larger state interests. But each successive designated enemy has been demonized. Even Daniel Ortega in the 1980s, Iran's Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, and Salvador Allende in the early 1970s. There is remarkable flexibility in this process. A leader like Cambodia's Pol Pot, another Hitler, quote unquote, and sometimes allegedly, quote unquote, worse than Hitler in the years 1975 to 1980, when the U.S. establishment was first trying to overcome the Vietnam syndrome, suddenly became a shadowy figure when the United States quietly began supporting him and the Khmer Rouge after their ouster in Vietnam in 1979. It would not have been helpful to the U.S. policy of bleeding Vietnam for the free press to have called attention to U.S. support for a man furiously sailed as a mass murderer a few years back. Always accommodating the free press remained silent. The history of Manuel Noriega displays the reverse pattern. This thief, murderer, and long-term collaborator with the drug cartel served as a paid CIA agent and was tolerated and used by the U.S. leadership for years, during which he was accorded minimal attention by the media, until he began to drag his feet on supporting the Contras and displayed other signs of inadequate subservience to his former Washington masters. Although his involvement in the drug trade had diminished over the years, in 1985, he suddenly became a very bad man, the kind the United States can't abide, and this government free press propaganda mill got us ready for his ouster. Saddam Hussein fits the Noriega pattern, a brutal dictator from the very beginning of his rule. He was referred to by Evans and Novak as handsome and toughly elegant, and saluted by the New York Times for his personal strength and more pragmatic cooperative line when his policies were in accord with U.S. interests in the mid-1970s. In the mid-1980s, he was quietly supported and supplied with arms by the West, and his shipping in the Gulf was protected against attack while he was committing aggression against Iran. Western support didn't flag when evidence surfaced that Hussein was using chemical weapons against the Kurds at home and the war against Iran. The New York Times even commended the United States and Soviet Union for having jointly supported Hussein in his war against Iran, apparently regarding the evidence of collective action as more important than the fact that it contributed to a major bloodbath. The United States even provided vast quantities of grain to Hussein, with $5 billion of U.S. government loan guarantees from 1983 to 1990. The Government Accounting Office, noting the prospective loss of $2 billion in these guarantee credits, commented that it seems that the U.S. desire to build strategic agriculture trade relationship with Iraq outweighed the apparent financial risks involved and discounted evidence of Iraq's human rights violations. With Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, however, U.S. officials and compliant free press once again reversed course and began to focus on wax indignant over Saddam Hussein's long, obvious, ugly features and military capabilities. Suddenly, with Hussein elevated to the top of the U.S. hit list, he was another Hitler, quote unquote. Naked versus properly attired aggression. Hussein's occupation, looting, and absorption of Kuwait was a case of naked aggression. Aggression is bad business, but calling it naked aggression means that we intend to do something about it. Our aggressions in Grenada, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Indochina were, of course, properly clothed in a cloud of justifying rhetoric, and given our power and propaganda muscle, they were not even designated aggression by the Western intelligentsia and press. Similarly, when states invade and occupy countries with our tacit approval and under our auspices, an invidious work like aggression, let alone naked aggression, is not applied. Indonesia's invasion of East Timor in 1975 occurred only hours after a visit by President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and was carried out with their tacit approval. UN actions to counter this aggression were nullified by US lobbying and votes, and the free press has always paid minimal attention to this occupation and slaughter. Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was also not naked aggression. It was another Operation Just Cause by rule of affiliation. South Africa's occupation of Namibia was condemned by the UN Security Council, General Assembly, and International Court between 1968 and 1971. South Africa simply ignored the orders to leave. This did not disturb the West's good relations with South Africa, and the United States actively collaborated with it in supporting Savimbi and destabilizing Angola. The imposition of an apartheid system in Namibia, the accompanying seizure of assets and looting, and the extensive repression and killing were of no concern to the West. And when the Southwest Africans People Organization, SWAPO, a national liberation movement, emerged in Namibia, it was not viewed as legitimate and given support. Like the ANC, it was treated as a terrorist organization. With naked aggression, no compromises are possible. The aggressor must be removed quickly and without retention of any ill-gotten gains. Otherwise, how will naked aggression of the future be deterred? And only naked aggressors need to be deterred. We will not even allow a naked aggressor to save face, so that he must accept humiliation as well as total defeat. The merit of this insistence on humiliation beyond the deterrence factor is that he may not be willing to accept this, in which case we can smash him on the basis of higher principle. Properly attired naked aggression is a different matter. South Africa's illegal occupation of Namibia was the basis of quiet diplomacy and constructive engagement over many years. The imposition of the system of apartheid on the black population of Namibia was not intolerable. The UN Security Council condemnations of its attacks on Angola were vetoed by the UN states. Mrs. Thatcher, the Iron Lady, eager to oppose Iraq's naked aggression by immediate force of arms, was the mush lady in response to South Africa's invasion, occupation, and extensive state terrorism, consistently opposed even to mild sanctions. In the 1980s, U.S. negotiations with South Africa and Angola, directed toward a Namibia-Angola war settlement, put great weight on South Africa's security interests and fears of Cubans in Angola. The Reagan-Bush-era position was never that the illegal occupation of Namibia should be terminated forthwith and without conditions. The larger framework of relations was taken into consideration. South Africa was able to maintain control of its strategic bay and the economic interests of its nationals, although obtained under a system of illegal occupation and coercion, were protected. But South Africa was not naked aggression. It was properly attired. Some white and the 150 dwarves. During the Gulf War, the U.S. establishment and mainstream media were indignant that once again the United States was having trouble getting its allies, with the exception of the Iron Lady, to join enthusiastically in burden sharing and support of military action against Iraq. They forget how much they owed us for the past police services and protection against the long threat of Soviet attack, and they seem unaware that we operate in the interest of the world community, not self-interest. Thus, what is good in the perception of U.S. leaders is good for the world, not just for ourselves. Those who join us in our international crusades recognize these truths, the view that Bush engineered the war to serve his own and other parochial U.S. interests, and that the war was damaging to the welfare of countries like Germany and Japan, is not even suggested, let alone debated. That the countries other than our Gulf protectorates joined us, either because of threats, bribery, or to try to exercise some constraint of the world's foremost quote-unquote loose cannon, is a cynical canon. Goals in daily transition. Although the goals of the Bush administration in the Gulf were submerged in a welter of public relations claims, it was somewhat acknowledged that officials and commentators that we were there to protect access and control over major oil reserves. The related threat of Saddam Hussein to oil supplies and prices, and thus to U.S. consumers, also received considerable play. Some have called this the, quote, lifestyle rationale for war. Of course, the Bush policy itself led to a substantial elevation in oil and gasoline prices, which later receded. It is not at all obvious that Saddam Hussein would be wanted or even able to elevate prices as high as OPEC pushed them in the 1970s, but he was less easily controlled than the authoritarians hitherto in charge, and he represented a growing independent force in the control of Arabian oil. He also threatened the military domination of Israel, the U.S. surrogate standing alone since the fall of the Shah. The occupation of Kuwait provided the Bush CIA military-industrial complex allies with an opportunity to reassert U.S. leadership of the Western world, to firm up U.S. domination of the Gulf and control over oil revenues, and to justify the imperial military deployments and budget imperiled by the disappearance of the Soviet threat. It was also designed to help Bush recoup his personal political fortunes. The banking, oil, pro-Israel, and military-industrial complex constituencies could be mobilized to support this new threat. But in my view, this was a presidential war par excellence, with causes to be found in the parochial and self-serving calculations of Bush and his security state coterie. The secondary effects of a major war in the Gulf, like large numbers dead, starving, and made refugees, is still another part of the world ravaged by Western military force, and even the substantial cost to the United States were of little interest to them. Aside from the threat of friendly control of oil sources, the real U.S. goals were rarely mentioned or debated. Nominal goals were featured heavily and evolved on almost a daily basis according to public relations assessments. Obviously, democracy in the Gulf could not be stressed as an objective. Rather, naked aggression ranked high. The, quote, lifestyle rationale for war was mentioned, but it seemed a little mundane. One administration official telling the press that it was important that people not see this as a battle over oil. In spite of this admonition, James Baker at one point suggested an even more mundane objective: jobs. The lead balloon was greeted with derision and cartoonists had a field day. Tony Auth in Philadelphia Inquirer showed a two-jimma flag raising, the flag reading, "Help Wanted," the heart-rending quote in the side reading, "It's about jobs." Jamie Baker, the threat that Iraq might soon have nuclear weapons, was also stressed, and being found to arouse public concern more than objectives was heavily stressed. In short, nominal objectives were ex post fluid, and opportunistic real objectives were rarely examined or considered in depth. The mere gook rule, quote unquote. During the Vietnam War, it was reported that cynical U.S. lawyers working in that country coined the phrase the mere gook rule to describe the very lenient treatment of given U.S. military personnel who killed, who killed Vietnamese civilians. This was a minor manifestation of the concept, U.S. contempt for poor yellow-skinned people we were allegedly, quote unquote, saving. The facts, the racist element in that war of salvation added to another extremely important factor influencing U.S. policy. The Vietnamese were voiceless in the United States, and the pain and material and human losses were politically irrelevant and largely unreported here, and only slightly less so in our free world allied and client states. The only politically relevant casualties were those of U.S. military personnel. We can express the foregoing in economics limbo by saying that Vietnamese casualties were quote-unquote externalities, and the marginal cost of dead Vietnamese was zero from the perspective of the important players in the U.S. political system. This made it feasible to employ capital-intensive methods of warfare in Vietnam with a lavish use of air and artillery firepower and extremely destructive weaponry in order to keep U.S. casualties down. The rule was, when in doubt, bring in the bombers to level what would automatically be called a suspected Viet Cong base. It is an interesting fact that napalm was used far more heavily in southern Vietnam than in the north. The reason being that North Vietnam, as an independent country, had some access to the world media, whereas the South Vietnamese peasantry was being, quote unquote, pacified by the United States in connivance with a local puppet military government, so that the people being saved were voiceless. Thus, the reverse side of the coin of policies to reduce U.S. casualties was enormous: casualties and devastation for the Vietnamese civilian population and land. The connection was never discussed in the mainstream media. The Vietnamese slaughter and destruction were politically costless to U.S. political and military leaders. These were mere gooks. When the war ended, the United States didn't have to spend a dime to help the Indo-Chinese societies. Excuse me. When the war ended, the United States didn't have to spend a dime to help the Indo-Chinese societies that the napalm fragmentation bombs, B-52 raids, and Rome plows had devastated and shattered. Even today, the U.S. establishment, when it designs to mention Vietnam, focuses on unaccounted for U.S. casualties, not the millions of mere gooks killed and beggared in our capital-intensive war of aggression. Apart from the failure to produce a clear quote-unquote win, a major problem with the Vietnam War was this, from the standpoint of leaders of the U.S. national security establishment, was that it lasted too long and produced too many U.S. casualties, even if only a tiny fraction of Indo-Chinese casualties. One avenue pursued in subsequent actions to avoid this problem was to pick on tiny victims that we could easily overwhelm. Another was to employ even more capital-intensive methods of fighting to get our casualties down to acceptable levels. These are matters that George Bush understands. He watched the Grenada experience, where a brief operation with few U.S. casualties was a resounding political success. He saw that the lies, the discrepancy in size of contestants, the bully factor, and the violations of international law were of no concern to the patriotic press. Bush's Panama invasion was a notable success in the Grenada mold. There was a brief embarrassment at not capturing Noriega in the first assault, but he eventually surfaced and was apprehended and brought to this country for trial. The press once again served the state with enthusiasm, swallowing the shifting rationale for downplaying the brazen illegality. In the mere gook rule, quote unquote, tradition, the press focused heavily on lightness of U.S. casualties and barely noted in passing that substantial number of Panamanians also died. Only 23 U.S. military personnel killed. What a triumph. In the first week of Operation Just Cause, estimates of Panamanian casualties were sparse, and pictures of Panamanian victims in areas of devastation were rare. The media tended to accept Pentagon casualties of 202 civilians killed and its inflation of Panamanian military casualties, ignoring evidence of Pentagon destruction of medical records and cover-ups of mass killings and mass graves. Serious evidence points to thousands of civilian deaths and massive destruction. Once again, the United States shattered a poor society, and as in the case of triumph over mighty Grenada, it was a success story. That is, there was a win, minimal U.S. casualties, the virtual suppression of what happened to the mere Panamanians during the war. The media also quickly dropped Panama from the news, so that the U.S. failure to pick up the pieces of yet another victim we had, quote, saved, did not cost Bush votes. It should be understood that our little brown brothers, quote unquote, always bring self-destruction on themselves. It works this way. We lay down the law saying that you must accept our terms without concession or qualification. In the case of Vietnam, the Vietnamese had to agree that our puppet regime would retain control of South Vietnam, or they would be bombed back to the Stone Age. Saddam Hussein had to get out of Kuwait with his tail between his legs, Cheney in abject submission, or be blown up. If our opponents do not submit, and we are obliged to blow them up, clearly it is their responsibility. The kinder, gentler America has never been visible to foreigners who stand in our way, and discussion of the cost of the Gulf War in this country, both in planning and in retrospective assessment, once again featured U.S. casualties in a brazenly exclusive way. The cost to the mere Arabs as sentient human beings was virtually ignored. This despite our alleged service as global policemen in the New World Order, and despite the supposed applicability of the West of a humane value system based on the Judeo-Christian ethos. Super lies. Superpower leaders can engage in super lying and get away with it. I recall vividly President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk intoning repeatedly in the mid-1960s that North Vietnam should leave its neighbors alone. Reagan and Schultz in the mid-1980s denouncing Nicaragua's revolution without borders, and Johnson stating that he was aching for negotiation with the Vietnamese, but simply couldn't find anybody to negotiate with. On the last point, we have a perfect analogy with George Bush and James Baker, who had allegedly tried diplomacy in the Middle East, but were obliged to fight because the enemy failed to respond. Johnson's ploy was to pretend to be interested in negotiations while secretly warning the North Vietnamese that only surrender was acceptable. It was well known in 1965 that Johnson had fended off all independent and indigenous Vietnamese attempts at a negotiated settlement and had put in place a puppet military regime in South Vietnam designed strictly to fight. But he had to clear the ground for war at home by public relations gesture. That his peace moves were phony and designed to manipulate consent at home was obvious to anyone who followed the unfolding events and had a vestige of sense and integrity. But the mainstream media hewed to the administration's propaganda line and played dumb. In response to an early PR effort, James Reston stated in the New York Times, October 18, 1965, that the problem of peace lies now not in Washington, but in Hanoi. Getting this core piece of information accepted by the media was essential to freeing the Johnson administration to fight a war in Vietnam. George Bush aborted and fended off any and all attempts at a diplomatic resolution to the Middle East crisis, and the belated Baker to Geneva to meet Iraqi leaders was openly a PR operation. In an exact follow-on to Johnson's secret message to Hanoi, Bush sent a private message to Hussein with an ultimatum demanding that he leave Kuwait unconditionally and promising to arrest and try him as a war criminal. Nevertheless, Bush and Baker repeatedly spoke of diplomatic options having been exhausted, and Bush, in his speech before the National Association of Religious Broadcasters on January 28, 1981, stated that the war in the Gulf was the last resort after extraordinary diplomatic efforts had been tried and failed. The truly big lie was not contested in the U.S. mass media. Paralleling James Reston's performance of 1965, Thomas Friedman wrote to the New York Times on January 20th, 1991, quote, "Now that diplomacy has failed," emphasis added, "and it has come to war, just as in 1965 it was essential to engineering support for war that the image to be conveyed that the United States was prepared to engage in serious diplomacy. And just as in 1965, the mainstream press helped to convey that message. The propagation of big lies does not require Pentagon censorship. The mass media do it freely and naturally. Censorship deals with the little lies, whether a plane was shot down or 10 rather than 6 body bags were shipped off today, not the big ones that portray our country as benevolent, fighting aggression, and eager for diplomatic solutions. The quote-unquote allies. One of the droller features of the U.S. assault on Iraq was the regular news reporting of attacks carried out by the quote-unquote allies under the United Nations auspices, not by the United States. Of course, the United States organized the allies using extensive arm-twisting bribery, threats, and misrepresentations of U.S. goals, with only Great Britain gung-ho in support, apart from the sheikdoms. It pushed the earliest possible use of force on members of this coalition. It alone decided when the war would start, and 90% of the bombs dropped by the Allies were of U.S. origin. The flow of information and disinformation about the Allied effort was also controlled by U.S. officials. The practice of the great power covering up its aggressive and violent strategies under the guise of collective action goes back a long way. In the first volume of his History of the Ancient World, in a chapter on, quote, the Athenian Empire, Michael Rotsoff describes how Athens bullied and manipulated client states in the 5th century BC as it carried out her ambitious foreign policy, and that all this was exceedingly displeasing to the Allies, as the subjects of the Athenian Empire were still officially called. During the Vietnam War, the United States mobilized fighting units from allies, quote-unquote, like Australia, Thailand, and Korea, which were essentially mercenary forces obtained by threats and generous revenue sharing, for which the kinder, gentler United States always finds resources. So the Vietnam War, too, was fought by allies, and the murderous Korean War, in which the United States almost completely leveled North and Central Korea with the systematic bombing of dikes and destruction of food and water supplies, the massive use of napalm, splashed Winston Churchill's phrase over houses, people, and animals, and coming close to precipitating a war with China and using nuclear weapons, was fought under the UN cover. It must have been consoling to the world to know that this was done by quote-unquote allies under UN auspices rather than by the United States alone. Super aggression as fighting naked aggression. The war with Iraq was the third major direct U.S. assault on a third world area in the last 40 years. I am not counting the attacks on Central America and numerous lesser but deadly interventions. In each case, the United States acted in the name of fighting aggression, transforming complex local events into rationales for embarking on campaigns of truly massive destruction. In the case of the Korean War, the question who started it remains controversial, but the United States quickly steered consensus to North Korean invasion without provocation and mobilized its allies and the UN as a cover for the virtual destruction of North Korea. In the case of Vietnam, also, the U.S. official position accepted by the mainstream media that we were countering aggression from the North, as well as internal aggression by the South Vietnamese, who had the audacity to resist the rule of our chosen proxies. In reality, the aggressors were the French, who tried to establish their colonial rule with U.S. and British assistance from 1945 to 1953, and then the United States roughly through 1975. The United States killed millions and left the Indochinese peninsula shattered. While it does not succeed in keeping puppet governments in power, successfully set back and badly damaged in the revolutionary process in Southeast Asia through extreme violence, a super aggression in the name of fighting a fabricated aggression. In Iraq, the United States fought in the name of countering aggression, and as it proceeded to smash a smaller power and lay waste another third world area. In this case, in contrast with Korea and Vietnam, there was a definite aggression by Iraq, but several points should be noted. First, the choice of aggressor to be smashed was highly selective, and the resistance to this aggression was organized by a country still occupying its previous victim, Panama. Second, the Iraqi aggressor aggressed against Iran from 1980 to 1988 with support from the United States and the quote unquote allies with a navy with nary a moral issue nor need to teach a lesson arising. Third, the United States virtually enticed Iraq to enter Kuwait, reassuring Saddam Hussein publicly and privately that the conflict was strictly an Arab problem and that we had no agreement to defend Kuwait. Such information was even given to Congress on July 31st, 1990, after the CIA had informed the Bush administration that an Iraqi army was poised for an attack on Iraq, and only 2 days before the invasion. The failure to try to constrain Hussein by diplomatic means and de facto invitation to invade reflects either staggering incompetence or remarkably sophisticated conspiracy to entrap. The failure of the U.S. mass media to consider this set of facts and issues as worthy of front-page reporting and intense debate is prime evidence of their irresponsibility to the public and service to the state. My own view is that the Bush team invited Hussein into Kuwait through sheer incompetence, but not only were they deeply annoyed when he did invade, they also saw that he could usefully be set up as a naked aggressor who must be taught a lesson. This would allow the Bush team to serve its own ends. See above the goals in daily transition. The main point here, however, is that the lesser and invited aggression by Iraq allowed a really massive aggression principle, quote unquote, being employed with extraordinary hypocrisy and opportunism. With its enormous resources, connections, pliable and purchasable allies and clients, and patriotic press, the United States can't get away with this. Its own aggressions disappear from view in support of allied and client state aggressions, are ignored. Its earlier support of Hussein and virtual invasion to him to invade Kuwait is not newsworthy. Its complete refusal to allow the invited aggression to be resolved by diplomacy is referred to as failed diplomacy, quote unquote, and its own plans for super aggression are treated as its own propaganda defensive response of the Allies to naked aggression. Operation Just Cause and Desert Shield. The Pentagon, CIA, and FBI never failed to produce code names for their various aggressive and subversive operations at home and abroad, often positive sounding when for public consumption, but frequently cynical and even sinister when for internal use. Operation Alpha, Bootstrap, Brotherhood Camelot, Chaos Jakarta, Minaret Phoenix, and Rat Killer Veritas Vulture. The selection of names would make an interesting study in value and propaganda strategies. The contrast between Operation Just Cause, Panama, and Operation Desert Shield, the Gulf, is perhaps a reflection of the fact that the invasion of Panama was a plain vanilla, quote-unquote, aggression in violation of international law. rationalized in terms of the need to depose a very bad man, we justifiably took the law into our own hands. For outsiders, this might look like lynch mob law. For property brought up U.S. citizens and press, it was high noon justice. But in this case, our legal position was extremely flimsy. We needed a name for the operation that would put it in a good and proper light. We did not require such verbal support for our occupation of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Operation Desert Shield would do, although the accompanying moral indignation over Iraq's aggression contained the usual breathtaking level of hypocrisy. Let me make a constructive suggestion, however, in the interest of alleviating our budget crisis. As all our operations are quote-unquote just causes, why don't we simply call them OCJ1, OCJ2, OCJN, and save a lot of money on public relations, ? Censorship and disinformation. The U.S. mass media did a marvelous job of helping George Bush engineer consent for his presidential war. One of their greatest achievements was transmuting Bush's skillful design, manipulation, and mobilization of war into a triumph of collective security and internationalism. Once the war was underway, the media moved even more aggressively into we-they winner-loser frame of reference, as if describing an exciting game, energetically rooting for the home team and ignoring alternative perspectives and inconvenient information. In light of the mass media's performance up to the January 17, 1991, the imposition of censorship by the Pentagon would seem as superfluous as bringing additional radioactive waste to Hanford, Washington. The cooperative media were even reluctant to call the Pentagon's rules for news reporting quote-unquote censorship, or to accuse the Bush administration and Pentagon of using disinformation. News reports from Iraq were regularly labeled and censored or state-produced, but this was not done for Pentagon releases and information through reporting pools, quote-unquote. The networks and the Times and Washington Post not only failed to join in suit against the Pentagon protesting the censorship, they did not even report the suit as news. The Pentagon censors news because it is greedy. It wants rooters who never criticize or misplay or boo a bungling quarterback. It takes a completely subservient clique. There is no doubt that the press would like details on casualties, even Iraqi casualties, that the war makers want kept under the rug. The media would surely stress our casualties more than enemy victims, but the Pentagon would prefer that neither be discussed. However, as even the Soviet military establishment harshly attacked the Soviet press for disclosures undermining the war effort in Afghanistan, unless we accept that the Soviet Union had an adversary press, the desire of the Pentagon to control the flow of information hardly proves the existence of an adversary press here. From Vittorio Mussolini to Tom Brokaw. In the earlier years, the statement of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's son Vittorio, a bomber pilot in Italy's attacks on Ethiopia in the years before World War II, were held up as the epitome of inhumanity and degeneracy of fascism. In his book Volia sul Ambe, published in Florence in 1937, Vittorio referred to war as the most beautiful and complete of all sports. His famous line was it was diverting to watch a group of galley Ethiopian tribesmen bursting out like a rose after I landed a bomb in the middle of them. The word beautiful appeared regularly in U.S. network TV coverage of the U.S. Allied bombing of Iraq on January 16th. In the days that followed, Tom Brokaw bubbled with enthusiasm at the threatening beauty of it, and CNN reporter of Saudi Arabia spoke of the most beautiful sight of the bombers taking off on their missions of glory. As Brent Sadler saw it on ITM, the night sky was filled with the star-spangled display of threatening force. Jim Stewart of CBS News referred to 2 days of almost picture-perfect assaults, and Charles Osgood of CBS found the bombing of Iraq a marvel. Like Vittorio, the free world establishment reporters uniformly exalted bombing attacks as exhilarating and aesthetically pleasing. They also uniformly failed to call attention to the fact that there might be human agony and death under the surface of their observations. In his science fiction novel, Fahrenheit 451, Roy Bradbury described a future in which people will be holed up with wall-to-wall TV, from which they would be treated as spectacles in the actual search for and execution of terrorists. U.S. TV coverage in the War of Iraq offered a bowdlerized infotainment variant covering the war in a game and propaganda format. The propaganda format was designed to show the war as in a good light from the standpoint of the administration, Pentagon, and weapons manufacturers, keeping casualties and collateral damage as far out of sight and mind as possible. In keeping with a culture of sports and games, it provided a controlled video game and sport exhibition of a high-tech war managed by the Pentagon and media to show good colors, high-tech successes over the enemy, excitement and interpersonal patriotic images, flags, pictures of our leaders past and present, patriotic scenes. It was picture perfect, as CBS's Jim Stewart said, because it was carefully selected and well managed. Vittorio Mussolini would have been impressed. War speak. The double-speak component of official and media messages reached new heights with the coming of the Gulf War, and some elements of the media even called attention to the development of choice Orwellianism's collateral damage. It is interesting that the media paid no attention to the ultimate Orwellianism perpetuated by Bush and some of his supporters, including editors of the New York Times, in obtaining congressional approval to fight. The classic illustration of an Orwellianism has always been that war is peace. In addressing Congress, Bush told it that a vote for him to give him war powers offers the best chance for peace, and many of his supporters made the same point. Following his success in obtaining congressional sanction to go to war, the newspaper of record editorialized that Congress has armed the president first and foremost for peace. There it was, a vote for war, which began within a week, was a vote for peace, exclamation mark. The phrase peacekeeping mission was also used by officials and the press to describe Bush's team efforts. Big Brother triumphed in the free society and the free press and free market via pre-market processes. In straight war speak, the aim is often to soften the language that might suggest unpleasant happenings, to lend support to our claims of benevolence and decency. Thus, after Desert Shield had served its role in the pretense that we were only defending our Gulf clients, Desert Storm was coined in the Defense Department for what others had called Desert Sword. Storm suggests natural forces, not a human instrumentality that applies to a cutting instrument to human flesh. War in the Gulf became an operation. Military forces were referred to as assets. Bombs, which suggest that things that kill and which are used by terrorists, were ordnance. Bombing raids were sorties and visits or revisits. The fact that we were killing people demanded linguistic adjustments. First, we had smart or precision bombs that could pinpoint military targets. This was done with surgical precision and surgical strikes, suggesting the careful removal of diseased tissue. The concept of surgical strike was developed during the Vietnam War to assert that we were aiming accurately at military targets and implying that we were able to avoid killing civilians. In reality, massive firepower was used to reduce U.S. casualties. Civilians were considered an ocean in which guerrilla fish swam, and inducing them to flee the countryside as indiscriminate firepower was part of U.S. policy. Vast numbers of Indo-Chinese peasants were killed in quote-unquote surgical strikes. It may be recalled that the neutron bomb was touted for only killing people and sparing structures, etc., so that combined with smart bombs, everything can be taken care of by the free world arsenals. During the Gulf War, the U.S. media were completely taken in by smart bombs. In the early weeks of the fighting, with the Pentagon only offering visual bombs on target, the media conveyed the impression that few, if any, civilians were being damaged by the unprecedentedly intense bombing raids. Eventually, it was revealed that the smart bombs were missing their targets about 40% of the time, and that only 5% of the bombs dropped were smart. The media's deception were compounded by their failure to pursue aggressively the question of the nature of targets, their proximity to civilian habitations and workplaces, and on the ground results of the bombings. If the national water supplies, electric power stations, roads and bridges, and sewage facilities were legitimate targets, this posed a threat to the water and food supplies and health that would be catastrophic to the civilian population. There was a further question that whether the civilian society had to be destroyed to get the aggressor out of Kuwait, or whether the scope of the devastation indicated a hidden agenda, points not raised in the mainstream media. In keeping with the national values on relevant casualties, the U.S. mass media gave these questions about zero attention during the fighting and minimal attention thereafter, except after the suffering of the Kurds under attack by an official U.S. enemy. The concept of collateral damage, quote unquote, derives from nuke speak and refers to allegedly unintended killing and destruction arising out of nuclear attack. It was used in the Gulf War as a complement to smart bombs and surgical strikes, acknowledging that despite all our precautions and precision, some civilians may have been killed and non-military targets destroyed. This difference between us and them is that they intend that their missiles and bombs hit civilian targets. This is terrorism. Our killing of civilians are inadvertent and tragic errors. Although thousands sorties a day, they might be regrettably frequent. The attempts to preserve the image of Uncle Sam as Mr. Clean, who used civilian-friendly smart weapons and didn't kill people, continued after the war as an established truth, maintained by a reluctance to report uncongenial information, and by keeping the eyes and benevolent concern firmly focused on the Kurds. The word slaughter was used with some indignation, but only in regard to Iraqis' appalling attacks on the Kurds, not in reference to the U.S. attacks on Iraqis. Both the Times and Post charted Iraqi losses and the toll of war, but only in regard to Iraqi weapons losses and without mentioning Iraq's human casualties. The Iraqis were mere Arabs, and as victims of U.S. violence, it is natural that they be disappeared by a patriotic media committed to protecting the image of U.S. benevolence. The self-censorship was really impressive. The propaganda line was captured in the headline of Patrick Tyler's article in the Times of March 31st, 1991. Clean win in the war with Iraq drifts into bloody aftermath. That the win was not bloody was a big lie, but now institutionalized. Murder by immobility. There still remained the uncomfortable problem of the Turkey shoot, quote unquote, in which a completely helpless army in retreat from Kuwait was mercilessly slaughtered by the weapons of doubtful legality, such as fuel air bombs. This has been handled by the mainstream media largely by eye aversion. However, Paul Berman, in the May 27, 1991 New Republic, offered another approach to apologetics for the Turkey shoot and provided a path-breaking innovation in doublespeak as well. He first directed attention to Saddam Hussein's and another Arabs declaring that the great retreat at great Iraqi victory, and railed indignantly at the perversity of the refusal to admit utter defeat. Although in the end he found the entire business quite laughable. Further, the reluctance to retreat, the too long delay before a life-saving panic setting, in short, the strange and horrifying immobility littered the desert with Iraqi corpses, was the very thing that constituted the Iraqi triumph, if not the present, then as a prelude at Saddam Hussein's word to the future. We laughed when these victory claims were broadcast to the world. The blame associated with the reluctance and delay in retreating is followed later by an explanation of why we were unable to negotiate peacefully with the Baathists, which it turns out is based on the contrast between those ultimately oriented toward natural reality, us, and something else, the Baathists. Apparently, Berman compares this realism internationally, contrast in the Gulf, with the difference between the conquering Spaniards and the Aztecs. In 1519 to 21. No sentiment nonsense from the realist Paul Berman, although there is some remarkable idiocy as well as self-deception in reference to the life-saving panic that hit the Iraqi soldiers. But the peace de resistance arises from Berman's inability to name the agent generating the corpses. He therefore describes it as strange and horrifying immobility that littered the desert with corpses, not these Turkey shooters from the United States. I guess those otherworldly Aztecs who, like the Iraqis' conscript soldiers, lack the reality principle. Berman does not mention the Judeo-Christian ethic, also died of a horrifying immobility. War crimes. During the Persian Gulf, the mass media were again indignant at enemy war crimes, while full of admiration for the restraint and cleanliness of our war makers. The premise seemed to be that we are good by definition, serving as the world's volunteer global policemen in another Operation Just Cause. The enemy had no right to fight back. It is reprehensible to shoot a cop on his beat. The U.S. media and Democrats had earlier accepted the Reaganite premise that even the Nicaraguans had no right to self-defense once the global cop had decided that their government must be removed. Hence, any arms the Nicaraguans obtained from abroad were by definition illicit and menacing. In the Gulf War, there was where there was naked aggression and where the cop was not beating up some small villain on his own. And in the face of a toothless international consensus of disapproval, any actions taken in self-defense were doubly illicit. As usual, the media paid no attention to whatever the possible war crimes, such as attacks on nuclear reactors, which violate international law, and the use on fuel air bombs, which the media pointed to as an ominous threat of chemical weaponry, when it was alleged, apparently falsely, that the Iraqis had them, but which they simply refused to discuss or investigate when it turned out the United States had and used these murderous weapons. The massacre of tens of thousands of completely demoralized retreating Iraqi soldiers in this Turkish shoot also raised questions of war crimes, but not in the patriotic media. During the Vietnam War as well, the press got quite angry over rebel attacks on U.S. military forces. The enemy simply wouldn't stand still and fight on our terms. Our use of defoliants on a massive scale, the deliberate and systematic destruction of food crops and by chemicals, the use of napalm, phosphorus, and fragmentation bombs, and the employment of B-52s for bombing of peasant villages, enemy base camps was given minimal attention that was never described in Indian language. It was never suggested that the use of free fire zones and skunk hunting, a bit of country boy fun and games, shooting from helicopters any Vietnamese that came in sight was criminal. During the Vietnam War, the press repeatedly regurgitated the assertions of U.S. officials and pilots that U.S. forces were bending over backwards to avoid harming civilians, a huge misrepresentation of fact. In 1991, Ted Koppel asserted that indeed the point needs to be made that great effort is taken, sometimes at great personal cost, to the American pilots. The civilian targets are not a hit. The statement based on solely on official statements. The record of official lying during Koppel's stint as ABC news person has been massive. The test of an independent journalist as opposed to state propaganda is that serial lying by his sources causes him to doubt the self-interested list has been massive. The test of independent journalists as opposed to the state propagandist is that serial lying by sources causes him to doubt the next self-interested statement. Koppel fails this test resoundingly, but in ample company. Pride and genocide. Bush managed us into a war of super aggression with the aid of Democrats. See the new book by John Kroll, Studies in Spinelessness, Press, Corporate Establishment, and General Populace. Senator George Mitchell, in calling for us to get behind the president, know that we have had our debate, so now we must rally round our boys, flag, God, and country, etc. Funny, I don't remember any debate in Congress or the press while the key decisions were being made. I recall some posturing after the mobilization of troops and UN consent for war was already obtained, but no debate except in a Pickwickian sense. We must give some credit here to the population at large, so easily mobilized by a hack politician demagogues who wrap themselves in the flag and lie incessantly and ooze insincerity and hypocrisy. Both Lyndon Johnson and George Bush, after having maneuvered us into war, called for prayers for peace and were not jeered out of office. This is a populace that can revel in beating up Grenada, in winning a 1984 Olympics from which only serious rival had been bullied into withdrawal, that applauds rival team quarterback injuries and systematically produces noise so that quarterback signals cannot be heard by enemy teams. This is a populace whose enthusiasm for war escalates upon seeing the bombs soaring through the air, B-52s and smart bombs, raining down on another relatively defenseless country, brings out flags and pride. This is a people who could elect and re-elect Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and vote for the unspeakable Bush Quail team. This is a people for whom Southern strategy works and who could wax enthusiastically about the swaggering bully, liar, and sycophant Oliver North. Normalizing the unthinkable, doing terrible things in an organized and systematic way, rests on normalization. This is the process whereby ugly, degrading, murderous, and unspeakable acts become routine and accepted as the way things are done. There's usually a division of labor in doing and rationalizing the unthinkable, with the direct brutalizing and killing done by one set of individuals. Others keep the machinery of death, sanitation, food supply in order. Still others produce the implements of killing or working on improving technology, a better crematory gas, a longer burning and more adhesive napalm, bomb fragments that penetrate flesh in hard-to-trace patterns. It is the function of defense intellectuals and other experts and the mainstream media to normalize the unthinkable for the general public. In the late Herman Kahn spent a lifetime making nuclear war palatable, thinking about the unthinkable, and this Strangleovian phony got a very good press. Normalizing shooting human fish in the Gulf barrel. During the Gulf War, with Uncle Sam was an equal opportunity employer, and our boys and girls were there doing their assigned jobs, repelling naked aggression in another Operation Just Cause. This war was focused upon us by Hussein's rejection of the UN's and allies' insistence that he disgorge Kuwait, much as Bush plainly did not want Anthony Lewis. He made it Operation Just Cause number 17, a game with winners and losers. We could reasonably root for us. the moral force to win. We were also defending Kuwait. And if once again the party was being saved, was destroyed, this was not our fault. Besides, there was the principle of non-aggression to which we are utterly devoted. The media could thus focus on our brave boys, girls, general officials to tell us about their plans, moves, reactions, and miscellaneous thoughts. We could watch them in action as they take off land, eat, joke, and express their feelings on the enemy, whether in folks back home in the big PX. They were part of an extended family doing a dirty job, but with clean bombs as the most moral certainty of a just cause. The point was not that the enemy was relatively defenseless in somewhat the same position as the natives colonized, exterminated, or enslaved by the West in past centuries of virtue of muskets and machine guns. See John Ellis' Social History of the Machine Gun. Our technical superiority reflects our moral superiority. It all seems like shooting human fish in a barrel. One must keep in mind that we are dealing with lesser creatures, grasshoppers, two-legged animals, cockroaches, people who don't value life as much as we do, who allowed another Hitler, quote unquote, to rule over them and who stand in our way. Only the voiceless could express the view that this was the most cowardly war in history. One of the effects of high-tech warfare, as well as the systematic focus of our casualties, plus censorship, official and self, is that the public is spared the sight of burning flesh. The enemy's casualties were given great prominence during the Vietnam War is one of the great and now institutionalized myths of our era. Morley Schaffers showing a GI applying a cigarette lighter to a Vietnamese thatched hut is used repeatedly to illustrate media boldness at the time because it was so extraordinary. It cost Saffer and CBS a lot of trouble, and has been made trying to make up for sin ever since. Enormous government pressure to flack from other sources caused the media to provide grisly photos of enemy victims only with the greatest caution and very frequently, especially in light of the grisly reality. Capital-intensive warfare in itself makes for distancing the public from the slaughter. The mere groups or Arabs. This is key to normalizing the unspeakable and unthinkable. On February 5th, 1991, the Philadelphia Inquirer carried an AP dispatch by Alexander Higgins. Marriage finds new expression in Gulf. Honey passed the bombs. It is a little romance of a newly married couple located in an airbase in Saudi Arabia and therefore regrettably obliged to sleep in separate tents whose function is to load bombs on A-10 attack jets. It is a personal internet story of two people and their relationship with a job to do in an unromantic setting. A fine study in the routinization of violence, of the banality of evil, and the ways it is impressed on the public. The UN and international law. The United States has displayed great flexibility in its concern within relation to the UN and international law. The rules are, when these can be met, used to meet our needs. We are their dedicated advocates. But when the votes are going the wrong way, the international law interferes with our plans. The UN and international law are treated with disdain or blithely ignored. The establishment, experts, and media fall into line without a peep. The brazenness of this dichotomized treatment and behavior carried out with considerable self-righteousness is remarkable. The United States can invade country after country in violation of both national and international law, accompanied by demonization process that pits the United States against Satan. Law is irrelevant when one is in conflict with Satan. It helps here that the mainstream media gloss over, if they mention at all, that Satan was our ally or paid agent until yesterday. The UN Charter of OAS agreements must be violated, but the press is reliably uninterested. The UN may vote condemnations of our invasions by large majorities, with only the United States and its closest allies and most dependent clients in opposition, but only a very careful reader of the papers will discover this occasionally on the back pages. When U.S. allies invade other countries, as Israel did Lebanon in 1982 and South Africa did Angola in 1981, among other occasions, the U.S. will veto UN Secretary Council condemnations. In these matters, we are not featured in the press, Council condemnations. These matters are also not featured in the press. When the United States is running roughshod over international law and the UN is voting against us by huge majorities, U.S. officials can rely on the fact that nobody is able to enforce the law against the dominant superpower and its wealthy allies and clients. No sanctions, let alone applications of force against the violator, and are even proposed because of their obvious unenforceability. Not only can the abusing power violate the law without penalty, The leaders and press complain bitterly that the UN and International Court of Justice are hostile forums and have ceased to be useful institutions as they were when the United States was an automatic majority at the UN. But when we are confronted with naked aggression, as in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, where the U.S. administration wants to maybe coordinate with UN approval and the sanction of international law, the United States suddenly is a passionate devotee of both. The media can be counted on, first, to avoid stressing or even noting the transformation from contempt and cynical violation when the UN and law aren't going our way, or even the contemporaneous double standard, as in simultaneous ignoring Israel's refusal to obey UN resolutions as a regular and ongoing affair. Second, the media can also be counted on to avoid looking closely at how a great power like the United States uses bribery and coercion to mobilize its supportive constituency for the selective enforcement of international law, intending to aggressive pressure employed. The rewards granted and penalties inflicted would suggest the use of raw power rather than mobilization by moral force for a highly moral enterprise. The U.S. manipulation of the UN and international law in the case of the Gulf War had many other facets. The UN resolution finally extracted the United States, giving it the right to go to war, did not require war. That was an option to be used if it needed to get Iraq out of Kuwait. The UN Charter makes itself force of last resort, requires that the Security Council find a peaceful means of resolution, have failed, and assigns responsibility for the use of force to the Council, not to the U.S. President. An excellent case can therefore be made that the U.S. attack on Iraq violated both the UN Charter and the UN implementing resolution. A Soviet agreement with Iraq, summarily rejected by the United States and the Allies, would have fulfilled the primary UN resolution without the killing of 50 to 100,000 Iraqi soldiers, mainly young conscripts, and causing massive destruction to Iraq and Kuwait. The Bush administration's refusal to accept or even consider this proposal was a de facto violation of international law and the UN resolution. The urge to assert power and kill was too strong in the U.S. leadership. On the rare occasions where the point was mentioned in the U.S. mass media, there was not the slightest expression of regret and indignation. They were quote unquote mere Arabs. While Bush was prating about the sacredness of international law, and while he and other establishment figures were threatening that Iraq would have to pay damages for its acts of vandalism in Kuwait, the Bush administration had a due bill for its own unlawful use of force against Nicaragua to the tune of $17 billion. The administration was reportedly twisting the arm of the Chamorro government to drop this claim in order to receive the puny $300 million that the United States had voted for its victim, but was holding back in the further exercise of blackmail. In another illustration of doublethink, the U.S. mass media allowed Bush and company to pontificate and moralize about the law in Iraq's bill for damages without saying a word about contemporaneous U.S. bill for damages. The impression was conveyed that the United States was being generous to Nicaragua. The question of international law, in the inconvenient case, was consigned to the black hole. The experts confirmed to doublethink schema very well. Conformed to the double schema very well. There were many op-ed columns on the proper mechanisms for bringing Saddam Hussein to justice, none of which mentioned the problems of U.S. debt to Nicaragua and the difficulty in bringing a superpower to abide by rule of law. The Times reported on April 19, 1991, that Thomas Frank, a professor of international law at NYU, thought that the United States should seek new authority from the UN before establishing refugee bases in Iraqi territory. These things, he said, should be done collectively and not unilaterally, as the United States had been especially careful to do up to this point. Because a nation's sovereignty were so violated, it could be a recipe for chaos. In connection with the 1986 decision of the International Court of Justice that the United States should cease its unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, the same Frank, in an op-ed column in the Times of July 17, 1986, contended that the United States should ignore the World Court because America, acting alone or with its allies, still needs the freedom to protect freedom. So when the United States is able to mobilize international bodies to do its bidding, when acting lawfully and is consistent with attaining its objectives, Frank sanctimoniously urges our meticulous adherence to the niceties of law. While the rules of law stands in our way, he allows that as the always righteous party, we may disregard it. This is truly responsible, if not politically correct, certainly really correct expertise in action. So that's it. That's the chapter, Repelling Naked Aggression. It was a little bit of a long chapter compared to the others, but let's make some comments here. So another Hitler, we discussed another Hitler, basically the history of Manuel Noriega, the reverse pattern, the thief, murderer and longtime collaborator of the drug cartel, served as paid CIA agent, was tolerated by the U.S. leadership for years, during which he was accorded minimal attention by the media until he began to drag his feet on supporting the Contras and displayed other signs of inadequate support or subservience to his former Washington bosses. So you can see, the Contras, if you don't support the Contras and you are in the same relationship, you become a target of the U.S. government. Again, they're white supremacists, murderous butchers, negligent racists, murderous butchers of white supremacy and Roman Catholicism. Another Hitler we also discussed, whenever the U.S. establishment wants to push somebody out of the top hit list and wishes to mobilize the public for a program of destabilization and aggression, a demonization campaign is unleashed. For the Reagan replacement of concern over human rights and terrorism as the heart and soul of U.S. foreign policy, in 1981, Gaddafi was brought in line. He was perfect foil, dark-skinned Arab, anti-Israel supporter of NL, national liberation movements, inclined to rhetorical excesses and sponsor of terrorists. Although hardly competitive with the United States and South Africa in this respect, and his emergence as a symbol of evil is a classic case of government-press collaboration for larger state interests. But each successive designated enemy has been demonized. Even Daniel Ortega in the 1980s, Iran's Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, and Salvador Allende in the early 1930s. Basically, Cambodia, we talked about Cambodia's Hitler. Naked versus properly attired aggression. Basically, when states invade and occupy countries without tacit approval and under our auspices, an invidious word like aggression, let alone naked aggression, is not applied. Indonesia's invasion of East Timor. We know Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, basically a genocide against the East Timorese people in 1975, occurred only hours after the president, Gerald Ford, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and was carried out with their tacit approval. UN actions, to counter this aggression were nullified by U.S. lobbying and votes, and the free press has always paid attention to this occupation and slaughter. So basically, East Timor, you can just occupy it. Again, the racist, murderous butchers, they're negligent, undisciplined, immature, corrupt, and dishonest and untransparent, murderous butcher white supremacists, racist butchers of the U.S. government. Continuing on, we talked about U.S. negotiations in South Africa, like the South African Angola, directed towards a Namibia-Angola war settlement, put great weight on South Africa's security interests and fears of Cubans in Angola. The Reagan-Bush-era position was never that the illegal occupation of Namibia by South Africa should be terminated forthwith and without conditions. The larger framework of relations was taken into consideration. We were friends with South Africa. The racist apartheid regime was friends with the United States. So our, championship equal rights, white supremacist champion equal rights people in the U.S. government were, okay with that. South Africa was able to maintain control of the strategic bay and economic interests of its nationals under illegal occupation and coercion were protected by the United States. So, of course, you can do whatever you want when you're, a white supremacist. A white supremacist can do whatever we want. We got to the mere gook rule, not to mention their races and their, racist epithets that the U.S. government, white supremacists, have in their, internal jargon, their internal language between each other that they discuss in the Congress secretly. The mere gook is one. The mere Arab is one. The mere niggers is one. The mere, all sorts of things. The mere Spix is one. All of these words are part of their vocabulary. The racist white supremacists in Washington have these nice racist epithets. But let's talk about the mere gook rule. So during the Vietnam War, it was reported that cynical U.S. lawyers working in that country had coined the phrase, the mere gook rule. They described the very lenient treatment giving U.S. military personnel who killed Vietnamese civilians. So that's okay. You can just, slaughter the Vietnamese civilians. No problem whatsoever. The U.S. contempt for poor yellow-skinned people, where it's allegedly saving the racist element in that war of salvation, added to another extremely important factor influencing U.S. policy. The Vietnamese were voiceless in the United States, and their pain and material and human losses were politically irrelevant and largely unreported here, and only slightly less so in our free world allied and client states. The only politically relevant casualties were those of the U.S. military personnel. So you can see the U.S. government, the white supremacists, they are, of course, negligent. They are immature. They are racist. They are murderous butchers. They are dishonest, deceitful, malicious, untransparent, covert and secretive thugs. They are thugs and angry murderous butchers. And those are the reasons that, they do all of these things. And those are the reasons they think they should get away with their, murderous butchery across the world. So continuing on, the Allies, the droller feature of the U.S. assault on Iraq. We made a lot of statements with respect to the U.S. assault on Iraq, news reporting, and that attacks carried out by allies under United Nations auspices, not by the United States, were okay. Of course, the United States organized the allies using extensive arm-twisting bribery, threats of misrepresentation of U.S. goals, with only Great Britain gung-ho in support. Of course, the racist regime of the British government, always gung-ho in U.S. murderous butchery in third world lands, anti-third world, pro-colonialist butchers of the U.S. government and the British government. They are both negligent, corrupt, dishonest, and immature, undisciplined, fraud white supremacists. That's what they end up being. So continuing on. The practice of great power in covering up its aggressive and violent strategies under the guise of collective action goes back a long way. We talked about the different in the different books in Athenia. During the Vietnam War, the United States mobilized fighting units from allies like Australia, Thailand, Korea, which were essentially mercenary forces obtained by threats and generous revenue sharing, quote unquote, with the kinder, gentler United States always find resources. So the Vietnam War, too, was fought by the Allies. And the murderous Korean War, we wanted to discuss the Korean War a little bit. The United States leveled Korea because they are murderous, racist butchers, anti-Asian butchers of the U.S. government. They, wanted to slaughter the mere gooks of Korea. That's the U.S. government's line, and they were okay doing so. They basically systematically bombed of dikes and destruction of food and water supplies. The massive use of napalm splashed, as in Winston Churchill's phase, over houses, people, and animals, and coming close to precipitating a war with China and using nuclear weapons was fought under the UN cover. So you can see this United Nations organization. It is a fraud run by the U.S. government and the Western colonialists. They basically bombed, and it was a murderous war, which was an illegal war of aggression by the U.S. government. Again, they are irresponsible, negligent, undisciplined, immature, racist thugs of white supremacy. So continuing on, we talked again about the point here is that the lesser and invited aggression by Iraq allowed a massive aggression principle being employed with extraordinary hypocrisy and opportunism. With its enormous resources, connections, pliable and purchasable allies and clients, and patriotic press, the United States can get away with anything. Its own aggressions disappear from view in support of allied and client state aggressions are ignored. Its earlier support of Hussein and virtual invitation of him to invade Kuwait is not newsworthy. Its complete refusal to allow the invited aggression to be resolved by diplomacy is referred to as failed diplomacy. So again, the U.S. press falling right in line with the frauds, the frauds of the U.S. government. It's the UNESCO dropout, the failed American journalism. It's just a group of bullshitters, white supremacist bullshitters, peddle the bullshit, and everybody just, sucks it up and takes it. All the stupids in the American public just suck it up and take it because they are fraud white supremacists, negligent, irresponsible, and, undisciplined, immature white supremacist frauds. Operation Just Cause and Desert Shield. We talk about Operation Just Cause in Panama and Desert Shield is perhaps a reflection of the fact that the invasion of Panama was a plain vanilla aggression in violation of international law. Rationalized in terms of the need to dispose of a very bad man, we justified and took the law into our own hands. But in this case, our legal position is being extremely flimsy. The invasion of Panama and the removal of Noriega is extremely flimsy. It was a violation of international law. Let's just accept that the United States government violated international law with impunity because they are mafia, white supremacist thugs. That's what they are. So continuing on. The Pentagon censors news. So censorship and disinformation. Remember, the U.S. government media is a censorship. It is a censored press. It is not a free press. It's a group of censoring frauds. The U.S. mass media did a marvelous job of helping George Bush engineer his consent for his presidential war. One of the greatest achievements was transmuting Bush's skillful design, manipulation, and mobilization of war into triumph of collective security and quote-unquote internationalism. In the light of the mass media's performance up to January 17, 1991, the imposition of censorship by the Pentagon would seem as superfluous as bringing additional radioactive waste to Hanford, Washington. The cooperative media were even reluctant to call the Pentagon's rules for news reporting, quote, on censorship, or to accuse the Bush administration and Pentagon of using disinformation. News reports from Iraq were regularly labeled as censored and state-produced, but this was not done for Pentagon releases and information through reporting pools. The networks and the Times and Washington Post not only failed to join in a suit against the Pentagon protesting this censorship, they did not even report the suit as news. The Pentagon censors news because it is greedy. It wants rooters who never criticize and misplay or boo a bungling quarterback. It likes a subservient clique. The press is, right in line with the American censorship. It is a censorship press. It is a racist group of censoring thugs. We talked about war crimes a little bit. We talked about the Iraq War, the war crimes of the Persian Gulf War, and the U.S. media indignant to the enemy war crimes. The premises were good. The world's global volunteer policeman, Operation Just Cause. The enemy had no right to fight back. It is reprehensible to shoot a cop at this peak. The U.S. media and Democrats had earlier accepted the Reaganite premises that even Nicaraguans had no right to self-defense. So we just threw the Sandinistas under the bus. Again, the white supremacists, deceitful liars, irresponsible, negligent, murderous white butchers of white supremacy. They are frauds of white supremacy. The Vietnam War as well. The press got quite angry over rebel attacks on U.S. military forces. The enemy simply wouldn't stand still and fight on our terms. The use of defoliants on a large scale, deliberate and systematic destruction of food crops by chemicals, the use of napalm, phosphorus, and fragmentation bombs, and the employment of B-52 for bombing of peasant villages, enemy base camps was given minimal attention and was never described in indignant language. When when the white, supremacist government commits crimes, it's okay. They're mere gooks. They're not doing it to white people. So it's okay. Again, racist American government, mafia thugs. So continuing on, the free fire zones and skunk hunting, country boy of fun and games. It was never the free fire zone skunk hunting from helicopters. Any Vietnamese that came in sight was criminal. It was all criminal. The press repeatedly regurgitated the assertions of U.S. officials and pilots that U.S. forces were bending over backwards to avoid harming civilians. A huge misrepresentation of fact. In 1991, Ted Koppel, the imbecile of the U.S. mass media, January 17th, that indeed the point needs to be made that great effort is taken, sometimes a great personal cost to American pilots. The civilian targets are not hit. This statement is based solely on official statement. The record of official lying during Koppel's stint as ABC News person has been massive. The test of an independent journalist, as opposed to a state propagandist, is that serial lying by his sources causes him to doubt the next self-interested statement. Koppel is a serial liar, is basically what it is. A serial liar and fraud of the white, the corporate American press, the white corporate fraud press, normalizing the unthinkable. Basically bomb fragments. The U.S. government spent all its time on developing this technology to incinerate people. They like the flesh of third world people. They like colonial butchery and extracting the flesh. So let's just look at what we're doing. Still others producing the implements of killing, on working on improving technology, better crematory, longer burning, and more adhesive napalm, bomb fragments that penetrate flesh in hard to trace pattern. It is the function of defense intellectuals and other experts and the mainstream media to normalize the unthinkable, even for the general public. So that's the American government. They are, negligent, cruel, racist, murderous thugs of white supremacy. And then finally, we talked about the UN and international law. The U.S. is, again, because it's not in UNESCO, it doesn't really care about international law. They can behave like immature thugs because they are irresponsible, negligent, corrupt and, dishonest, deceitful, and, just poor white supremacists, negligent, dishonest, deceitful, malicious white supremacists that they can, whatever they want to, they'll follow the UN. If the UN touts their horn, they're good with it. Otherwise, the U.S. government is, beyond prosecution because they are racist, white supremacists, murderous butchers. So let's just finish. Beyond hypocrisy, decoding the age of newspeak in an age of propaganda. We talked again about the British government's, full, Thatcher and Reagan's removal, withdrawal from UNESCO, curtailment of access, secrecy, covert operations, deception, and manipulation of the press, British-American fraud. We talked about the different colonial regimes of Britain and their racist oppression, their exploitation, the fact that they are despicable and are hated throughout the third world. We then talked about African colonialism. We talked about French colonialism, including Vietnam, Ponchot, and Lecoultre, and the Cambodian genocide. Again, join me tomorrow for one chapter. It's going to be a shorter tomorrow. Great, you can join us. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.